Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Israel, Qatar, and Tunisia to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in this meeting, in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. Members of the Council have before them document S/2024/173, the text of a draft resolution submitted by Algeria. The Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution before it. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements before the vote. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. My sincere appreciation for your efforts in convening this meeting to deliberate and take action on the draft resolution S 2024-173. The draft resolution under consideration is the culmination of extensive discussions among Council members. As the primary custodian of international peace and security, the Security Council cannot afford passivity in face of the call for a ceasefire in Gaza. By presenting this text, our intention is to empower the Council to fulfill its mandate and protect lives, commencing with an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Ample time have been afforded for Council members to deliberate on the content of the text. Our approach involved meticulous consideration of received proposal and amendment, resulting in what we believe is a balanced text, capable of garnering broad support. The draft resolution underscores key elements, including 1. A humanitarian ceasefire. 2nd, unhindered aid delivery to all parts of the Gaza Strip. 3rd, rejection of forced displacement of Palestinians. 4, compliance with provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice. And 5th and last, the imperative for all parties to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law. Madam President, throughout this process, we have heard calls to give time to a parallel track in order to preserve its chances. with concern raised that any action from the Council would jeopardize this effort. However, almost 1 month after the ICG orders, signs of hope are still absent for improvement of the situation in Gaza. Silence. Silence, we contend, is not a viable option. Now is the time for action and the time for truth. Madam President, members of the Security Council bear the responsibility of voting in favor of measures that uphold international peace and security. This resolution is a stance for truth and humanity, standing against the advocates for murder and hatred. A vote in favor of this draft resolution is a support to the Palestinians' right to life. Conversely, voting against it implies an endorsement of the brutal violence and collective punishment inflicted upon them. A positive vote for the draft brings hope for hundreds of thousands of children to return to school and enjoy their right to education. Conversely, voting against the draft resolution is a vote in favor of annihilating their dream for a better life. A vote in favor of the draft resolution stands in solidarity with the right of Palestinian women, while opposing it means to accept degrading practices that destroy their dignity. Furthermore, supporting the draft resolution means endorsing the Palestinian right to food. Rejecting it constitutes, however, an approval of starvation as mean of war against hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. A vote in favor of the draft is a defense of the right to health, while voting against it is an approval of violation of hospital sanctity and an announced death of those who escaped it in the first place. Madam President, the Council must not merely call for a ceasefire. It must ensure steadfast adherence by all parties. The international community must act swiftly, as the value of ceasefire diminishes with each passing moment. We are rapidly approaching a critical juncture where the call to halt the machinery of violence will lose its significance. Today, every Palestinian is a target for death, extermination, and genocide. We should ask ourselves, how many innocent lives must be sacrificed before the Council deems it necessary to call for a ceasefire? for us, and I hope for all the security members. I hope for all the Security Council members, Palestinians. Palestinian lives matter. Each one of us decide where to stand in this tragic chapter of history. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Colleagues, for months, the United States has tirelessly pushed toward a goal that all of us should aspire to: a sustainable resolution of the Gaza conflict so that Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side and enjoy equal measures of security, dignity, and freedom. To build towards that future, the United States is working on a hostage deal between Israel and Hamas, along with Egypt and Qatar. This hostage deal would bring an immediate and sustained period of calm to Gaza for at least 6 weeks. And from there, we could take the time to build a more enduring peace. President Biden has had multiple calls in recent days with Prime Minister Netanyahu, as well as the leaders of Egypt and Qatar, to push this deal forward. And though gaps remain, the key elements are on the table so that if an arrangement is reached, it would help create the conditions for sustainable cessation of hostilities, which I know all of us would like to see. Of course, we want this deal to happen as soon as possible, as is shown by our exhaustive efforts. But sometimes hard diplomacy takes more time than any of us might like. Believe me, I understand the desire for the Council to act urgently, to positively shape the situation in line with the Security Council's mandate. Still, that desire cannot blind us to the reality of the situation on the ground. It cannot come at the expense of undermining the only, and let me repeat, the only path available toward a longer, durable peace. And that is why you've heard me say over and over again, any action this Council takes right now should help, not hinder, these sensitive and ongoing negotiations. And we believe that the resolution on the table right now would, in fact, negatively impact those negotiations. Demanding an immediate, unconditional ceasefire without an agreement requiring Hamas to release the hostages will not bring about a durable peace. Instead, it could extend the fighting between Hamas and Israel, extend the hostages' time in captivity, an experience described by former hostages as hell, and extend the dire humanitarian crisis Palestinians are facing in Gaza. None of us want that. And so I reiterate the United States' belief that while numerous parties engage in sensitive negotiations, this is not the time for this resolution, which jeopardizes these efforts. Colleagues, I communicated our concerns publicly and privately over the last several weeks. We've submitted numerous rounds of edits. All were ignored. And so for that reason, the United States has offered an alternative resolution that would do what this text does not: pressure Hamas to take the hostage deal that is on the table and help secure a pause that allows humanitarian assistance to reach Palestinian civilians in desperate need. Again, there's much more we all agree on, and the alternative resolution put forward by the United States is rooted in those shared beliefs. To start, in line with President Biden's comments last week, our text calls for a temporary ceasefire in Gaza as soon as practicable, based on the formula of all hostages being released. Last I checked, No one here opposes this. A majority of us also agree that it's time for this council to condemn Hamas. We know because you provided that feedback to Russia on its PRST and to Algeria on its resolution, a feedback that was inexplicably ignored. Should the US resolution be adopted, it would be the first to condemn Hamas for the abhorrent attacks of October 7th, including the sexual violence documented that day. The US text also makes clear that Hamas has no place in future governance of Gaza, nor does Hamas represent the dignity or self-determination of the Palestinian people. Again, all things I believe we agree on. In addition, our draft states there can be no reduction of territory in the Gaza Strip and rejects, as we have before in Resolution 2720, any forced displacements of civilians in Gaza. It also highlights the concerns many council members have regarding the fate of civilians in Rafah, making clear that under current circumstances, a major ground offensive into Rafah should not proceed. Colleagues, this is not, as some members have claimed, an American effort to cover for an imminent ground incursion. Rather, it is a sincere statement of our concern for the 1.5 million civilians who've sought refuge in Rafah. Civilians must be protected and have access to humanitarian assistance and basic services. On that note, our text outlines a path for implementation of Resolution 2712 and 2720, including provisions that call for the expansion of aid at scale. It also further clarifies and strengthens the mandate of the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza, Sigrid Kaag, whose plan I know we all support. As in previous resolutions, it places an emphasis on the protection of civilians and humanitarian workers, and it calls for lifting all barriers to the provision of humanitarian assistance, opening additional humanitarian routes, and keeping current border crossings open. Our draft also aims to support the Secretary General's effort to investigate those UNRWA personnel who directly participated in October 7th, and it supports the work of the independent review group led by Catherine Colonna, focused on ensuring UNRWA's neutrality. These and other steps are necessary to restore donor confidence. Finally, and as always, the draft reiterates our unwavering commitment to the vision of the two-state solution, where two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, live side by side in peace, within secure and recognized borders, under a revamped and revitalized Palestinian Authority. Colleagues, this resolution reflects the many ideas that have been shared over the past month, but which are not reflected in the text before us today. And we believe it will both support the ongoing negotiations and lay the groundwork for a sustainable peace in the region. But in addition to getting the what of this text correct, we also know it's critical to get the how and when of it right too. We will work in earnest in negotiating this text, and indeed intend to leave time for everyone to comment rather than impose an arbitrary deadline for the vote. Colleagues, we're at a pivotal moment and a critical one. Critical for the hostages who've been held captive for nearly 20 weeks in Gaza, and critical for their families who are desperate to be reunited with their loved ones. Critical for Palestinians whose homes and families have been destroyed and who now wonder where they'll find their next meal. Critical for Israelis, many of whom are still displaced or face barrages of rocket fire. Critical for Palestinian civilians in the West Bank who are at heightened risk of extremist settler violence. Critical for humanitarian workers and journalists. who put their lives on the line every day to do their jobs, and critical to everyone who desperately want to see sustainable peace in this region. That includes, I believe, every single person in this room. And so let us commit to doing this the right way and at the right time. So
estimates.
Все это время
In
Совет
all this time,
Безопасности
the United
ООН не
Nations
может
Security
принять
Council has been
критически важное
unable
решение
to
с
adopt a
требованием о
critically
немедленном
important resolution
прекращении
with a
огня.
demand for an immediate ceasefire.
Хочу напомнить,
I
что
wish to
16
recall
октября
that
прошлого
on the
года, когда
16th of
России был
October
предложен
last year,
самый
when
первый
Russia
проект
proposed the very
резолюции с таким
first
призывом,
draft resolution with this call,
количество погибших
the number of
палестинцев
the dead
было около 1000
Palestinians were
человек.
approximately 1,000 people.
Тогда западная
At that
делегация в
point, when
Совете
delegation
поддержала
preferred not to incur the honor of watch
не будет
to 28,000 declarations on commitment to international humanitarian law, the protection of civilians and humanitarian personnel.
С тех пор
Since then,
Соединенные
the
Штаты
United States
трижды
three
применяли право
times
вето, чтобы не
exercised the right
допустить
to the
принятия
veto,
Советом
exercised their veto in
требования о
order to
прекращении
prevent
огня.
the Council's adoption of demands for a
Каждый раз
ceasefire. Each
мы слышали
time
от американской
we
делегации
heard from the
одни и
U.S.
те же
delegation
лицемерные
those
призывы
same
еще немного
duplicitous and
подождать,
hypocritical calls to just wait a
дать
little bit
время для их
longer, to
якобы
give
эффективной
time for
двусторонней
their
дипломатии на земле.
allegedly effective
Но
diplomacy
никакого
on the
результата
ground.
она так и не
However,
принесла.
this did not yield any
Да и не
results
могла
ultimately,
принести,
and it
так как
could not
реальная цель
yield any
Вашингтона не
results
мир на Ближнем
because the
Востоке
real
и не
goal of
защита
Washington is
мирных
not to
жителей,
achieve peace in the
а
Middle East,
обеспечение
not
своих
to protect
геополитических интересов,
civilians, but rather to
требующих любой
advance their
ценой выгородить
geopolitical
своего ближайшего
agenda, demanding at
ближневосточного
any
союза.
cost for their closest Middle East ally to be
Поэтому Вашингтон,
shielded. This is
продавив
why
в резолюции
Washington, having
Совета
pushed through in
Безопасности
Security Council
2720
Resolution
фактическую
2720
лицензию Израиля
an
на
effective
убийство
license to
палестинцев
kill for
на
Israel,
оккупированных
to
палестинских
kill
территориях
Palestinians on the
под
occupied
предлогом,
Palestinian territory
цитирую,
under the
создания
pretext of, I
условий
quote,
для
establishing
прекращения боевых действий,
conditions for cessation
о
of
чем мы
hostilities,
предупреждали,
which is something we warned
продолжает
about,
обеспечивать международную
continues
защиту
to
властям
provide
Западного
international
Иерусалима
cover
и
for
их
the authorities of
безнаказанность
Western
за многочисленные
Jerusalem and
преступления против
uphold
израильтян.
their impunity for myriad crimes against the people of Gaza.
Уважаемые коллеги,
Distinguished
делегация
colleagues,
Алжира
the
от имени
delegation of
арабской
Algeria, on
группы
behalf of the
предложила
Arab
солидный,
group,
сбалансированный
proposed
проект
a
резолюции, в
robust,
центре
balanced
которого
draft resolution,
долгожданное
at the heart
прекращение
of
огня.
which is a long-anticipated
Алжирские
ceasefire.
коллеги
Our
добросовестно
colleagues, our
организовали
Algerian
переговорный
colleagues,
процесс,
organized negotiations
консультировались
in
со
good
всеми
faith,
делегациями и
conscientiously.
старались
They
максимально
consulted with all
участвовать в изучении.
delegations, and they strove to
Хотим
take their
отдельно
remarks into
отметить
account, and we wish to highlight in
профессионализм
particular
алжирской
the
переговорной команды.
professionalism shown by our Algerian negotiating
Однако
team.
делегация Соединенных
However,
Штатов
the
на этот
U.S.
раз с самого
delegation this
начала
time,
фактически
from the
поставила
very beginning,
ультиматум,
effectively
требуя остановить
put
работу над
forward
документом.
an ultimatum demanding a halt
Наши
to work on
американские
the
коллеги
document.
утверждали,
Our U.S.
что
colleagues
представленный
asserted
Алжиром проект
that the
опасен,
draft
так
proposed
как
by
может помешать
Algeria was
деликатной
dangerous insofar as it
дипломатии
would
на земле.
obstruct so-called delicate diplomacy
Только
on
что
the
мы слышали
ground.
то же
We
самое
just
в этом
heard
зале.
the same in this hall.
Призываю вас всех
We
вдуматься
call
в
on all of
цинизм
you to
этого аргумента.
consider the
Фактически
cynicism of
Вашингтон
this
заявляет,
argument.
что Совет
Effectively, Washington
Безопасности
has
ООН
been
стоит на
proclaiming
пути его
that the
планов
Security
и
Council of the
требует
United
от него не
Nations is in the
мешаться
way
под
of its
ногами.
plans and demanding that it, the Security
А
Council,
моя
not interfere in
коллега,
the U.S.'s plans.
американская
And
коллега,
my
еще вчера
U.S.
публично
colleague just
заявила, что на
yesterday
голосовании будет
publicly
выступать
stated
против
that they
алжирского
would
документа.
vote against the Algerian
Уважаемые
draft.
коллеги, Соединенные Штаты
Distinguished
раз за
colleagues, the
разом
United States
демонстрируют
time and time
полное
again has been
пренебрежение
demonstrating
как к
utter
международным
disregard
институтам
both
и
for
многосторонней
international
дипломатии,
institutions and multilateral
так и к международному
diplomacy
праву.
and international law.
Сегодня на кону, по
Today,
сути, авторитет
essentially,
Совета
the
Безопасности ООН.
authority and the standing of the United
Призываем
Nations Security
членов
Council is
Совета
at stake.
Безопасности
We call upon the
продемонстрировать
membership of the Security
солидарность
Council
в
to demonstrate
противостоянии
solidarity to counter
произвола
the
Вашингтона,
lawlessness of
который
Washington,
готов на любые
which is
жертвы в
willing to
любом регионе
countenance
для
any
реализации своих
sacrifice in
геополитических
any
амбиций.
region for the advancement of its
Американское
geopolitical ambitions.
правительство не
The
заботит
U.S.
ни жизни
government has no
газовитян, ни
concern
мнения
either
их
for the lives of
собственного народа,
the people of
где
Gaza
все
nor the
громче
views of its
звучат
own
голоса в
people
поддержку
who are
Израиля.
increasingly vocal in their support of the Palestinian
Хочется
people.
верить, что в
We should like
государствах
to
других
hope that
членов Совета
within other
Безопасности все же
UN member
принято
states and
прислушиваться,
member states
если
of the
не
Security
к голосу
Council,
совести,
that they generally
то хотя
listen
бы к
not,
общественному
if
мнению.
not to at least the voice
Оно
of
больше не
conscience, but
простит
at least to public opinion.
Организации
Public
Объединенных
opinion
Наций
will
бездействия.
no longer forgive United Nations
Ситуация на юге
inaction.
сектора
The
вокруг города
situation in the
Рафах
south of the
в
strip
контексте
around the city
военных
of
планов
Rafah
Израиля
is in the
крайне
context
опасна.
of Israeli military plans
Их
extremely
реализация
dangerous.
приведет к
The
катастрофическому
implementation of these
разрастанию
plans will
масштабов
result in a
гуманитарного бедствия,
catastrophic
в эпицентре которого окажутся более
increase in the
миллиона
magnitude
жителей
of the
сектора
humanitarian
Газа,
disaster, at the
бежавших от
epicenter of
боевых
which are
действий в
more than
этот
1
город
million
на границе с
residents of Gaza who have fled hostilities in the city to the border with
Необходимо
Egypt.
сделать все
There is a
возможное
need to
для
do
предотвращения
everything
такого развития
possible to
событий.
prevent this kind of a
Наша
development.
общая задача как
Our
можно
shared
скорее
objective
остановить
is to
кровопролитие
stop
и
the bloodshed
обеспечить
as soon as
условия для
possible and to
налаживания
provide conditions for the establishment of
устойчивых каналов
sustained
оказания
channels for
гуманитарной
the delivery of
помощи
humanitarian
населению
assistance
анклава.
to the people in the Strip.
Призываем
We
членов Совета
urge the Security
Безопасности
Council
проголосовать
membership
в
to vote
поддержку
in support
алжирского проекта.
of the
Благодарю.
Algerian draft. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2024/173 please raise their hand? Those against? Abstentions? The result of the voting is as follows: 13 votes in favor, 1 vote against, 1 abstention. The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. Colleagues, over the past few weeks, we have made incredibly clear that the resolution before the Council would not achieve the goal of a sustainable peace and may in fact run counter to it. Proceeding with a vote today was wishful and irresponsible. And so while we cannot support a resolution that would put sensitive negotiations in jeopardy, we look forward to engaging on a text that we believe will address so many of the concerns we all share, a text that can and should be adopted by the Council so that we can have a temporary ceasefire as soon as practicable, based on the formula of all hostages being released. This temporary ceasefire is critical to getting aid into the hands of Palestinian civilians who desperately need it. We should look towards this text so that we can finally condemn Hamas for their horrific attacks on October 7th, which set this conflict into motion, so that we can empower Senior Coordinator Cog and the United Nations, because her success is the UN's success. And it is so very needed to ensure civilians get the aid that they need more efficiently and effectively, and just more, period. And so that ultimately we can together help create a future in which Israelis and Palestinians live in states of their own, side by side, in peace. We're committed to engaging constructively on our resolution with you all in the days to come to that end. And we will continue to tirelessly engage in direct diplomacy and negotiations on the ground. Thank you.
Representative of the United States for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
谢谢主席女士。
Thank you, Madam President.
主席女士，
Madam President,
中方对
China
刚才的决议草案
expresses its strong
赞成票
disappointment
我们对决议草案
and
遭到
dissatisfaction
美国的否决
with the
表示
outcome of
强烈
the
不
vote
满
just taken. We
和失望。
have voted in favor
阿尔
of
及
the
利亚代
draft
表
resolution.
阿拉伯国家提出决议草案，
Algeria,
要求在加沙
on behalf of the
立即
Arab
实现停
states,
火，
put forward the
立即
draft
释放
resolution
全部
demanding
人质，
a
保障
immediate
人道
ceasefire
物
in
资
Gaza,
准入，
immediate release of all
反对
hostages,
强制
guaranteed
转移。
access for humanitarian
这
supplies,
既
and
是形
opposition
势的
to
紧迫
forced
需要，
transfers.
也
This
是
is
基
both
于人道最起码
urgently
的要求，
required by the situation on the
理
ground,
应得
and
到
it is
安
also
理
based
会
on the
所有
minimum
成员
requirements
的
of
支
humanity,
持，
and it should deserve the support
阿
by
尔及利亚
all council members.
展现出理性、
Algeria,
真诚、
by
开
displaying
放的态
reason,
度，
sincerity, and
就
open
决议草案
attitude,
同各方进行
held
长时间
lengthy and
广泛的
extensive
磋商，
consultations with all parties on
采
the
取
draft
了
resolution,
许多建设性意
and
见，
took on board many
让
constructive
草案
ideas,
内容
making
更加
the
平衡。
draft resolution more balanced.
今天的表决结果
The
清楚
outcome
说
of
明，
today's vote
在加
clearly
沙停火
shows
止战问
that
题
on
上，
the issue of a
不是
ceasefire
安理
to
会
halt the
没
fighting
有
in
压倒
Gaza,
性共
it
识，
is not that the Security
而
Council
是美
does
国
not have an
行使否
overwhelming
决
consensus,
扼
but
杀了
rather
安
it
理
is the
会的共识，
exercise of the veto by the United
美国
States
的
that
否
has
决
stifled the Council
释放了
consensus.
错误信
The
号，
U.S. veto sent
把
a
加沙
wrong
局势
message,
推到
pushing the
了更
situation
危
in
险的
Gaza
境地。
into a more dangerous one.
正当安理会停火决议
While the
被否
Security
决时，
Council ceasefire resolution is being
加沙的
vetoed,
无辜百姓
innocent
正
civilians in
在战
Gaza
火
are
中丧命，
dying in the fighting,
正在
and they
死
are
亡边缘
struggling
挣
on
扎。
the brink of death.
美国声称安理会
The
决议
U.S.
会干
claimed
扰
that the
正在
Council
开展的
resolution
外交
would
努力，
interfere with the
这
ongoing
种说法
diplomatic efforts.
是完全
Such a
站不住
claim
脚的。
is totally
当
untenable.
前形势下，
Given the
在立
situation on
即
the
停火
ground,
问题上，仍
the
然消极
continued
回避，
passive
无
avoidance
异于
on an
为
immediate
继续杀
ceasefire
戮
is
大开绿
nothing
灯。
different from giving a green light to the
正当安
continued
理会停火
slaughter.
决议被否决时，
While the Security Council
冲
ceasefire
突外溢
resolution is
正
being
在使整
vetoed,
个
the
中东地区
spillover of the
动
conflict
荡
is
不安，
destabilizing the entire
更
Middle
大
East
范围的
region,
战争风险
leading
正在上升。
to a
只
rising
有
risk
熄灭
of a
加沙
wider
战火，
war.
才
Only
能
by
防止吞噬
extinguishing the
整个地
flames of
区
war
的
in
地狱
Gaza
之火。
can we prevent the
安理会必须
fires
尽
of
快
hell
采取
from
行动，
engulfing the
阻止
entire
这
region.
场
The
中
Council
东浩
must
劫。
act quickly to stop this
正当安理
carnage
会
in the
停火
Middle
决议
East.
被否决时，
While the Council
国
ceasefire
际法的
resolution is
底线
being vetoed,
正
the
在遭
basics of
到践踏，
international law are being
多
trampled
边体系
upon,
基石
and the
正
bedrock
在遭
of
到
the
侵蚀。
multilateral system is being eroded.
联合国秘书长
The
已经
Secretary
援引
General
宪
of the
章第
United
99
Nations
条
has already
致
written
函
to the
安理会，
Council invoking
国际法
Article
院
99
也
of the
发布
Charter,
了临
and the
时措施，
International Court of Justice has
对于加
issued
沙冲突
provisional
中严
measures.
重违反国际法
The
和
Council
国际
must
人道法
respond
的行为，
forcefully
安理会必须予
to
以
the
有
serious
力回应。
violations of the
维护
international
国
law
际
and
法治的
international
权威。
humanitarian law in the Gaza conflict
主席女
and
士，
uphold the authority of
安理会
international
必须
rule of
采取
order.
行动，
Madam
推动
President,
实
the
现停
Security
火。
Council must take
这
actions to push
不
for a
应该
ceasefire.
是一个
This
还需要
should
争
not
辩
be
的
a
问题，
matter of debate,
而是安理
but
会不
rather
容
this
推
is
迟
a
的道
moral
德义务，
obligation that the Council
是安
cannot
理
shy
会必须
away.
承
It
担
is a
的
legal
法律义务，
responsibility that the Council
更
must
是安理会
assume.
履行
Even
联合
more
国宪
so,
章
this
的
is a political
政治
requirement
要求。
that the Council must
否决
fulfill
不能
in
掩盖
accordance
停
with
火
the
止战
Charter.
的
The
强烈
veto
呼声。
cannot muffle the
安理
strong
会维
call
护
for a
正义，
ceasefire and an
履
end to the
行
war.
职责的
The
脚
Security
步
Council
不
cannot
会
stop
因
its
此
work
停顿。
to uphold justice and
中方
fulfill
敦
its
促以色列
responsibilities just
倾
because of
听
the
国
veto.
际社会的呼声，
China urges Israel to
取
heed
消
the
对
call
拉
of the
法的进
international
攻计划，
community, abandon its
停
plan for
止对巴
Rafah
勒斯坦民
offensive,
众的
and
集体
stop
惩
its
罚。
collective punishment of
我
the
们
people
期
of
待有重要
Palestine.
影响的国家
we
少
expect
一些
countries
政
having
治算计，
significant influence to
真
do
正秉
less of
持
their
公正
political
和
calculations,
负责
to
任
be
态度，
truly
为
impartial
推动
and
加沙停火
responsible, and
做出
to
正
make
确
the
选
right
择。
choice in pushing for a
我
ceasefire in
们呼吁
Gaza.
国际社
We
会
call on the
汇聚
international
一切外
community
交
to
努力，
pool all
给加
diplomatic
沙民
efforts
众
to give
活
the
下去
people
的
of
机会，
Gaza a
给
chance to
整个
live,
中东地区
and
人
give the
民
people of the
拥
entire
有
Middle
和
East
平的机
region
会，
a chance to
给
have
伸
peace,
张正义
and
一个机
give
会。
it a chance for
谢谢主席。
justice to be upheld. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We voted for the resolution because the killing of civilians in Gaza must stop. The suffering that Palestinians are enduring is beyond anything a human being should be subjected to. A possible Israeli ground offensive in Rafah would have unimaginable humanitarian consequences. It would push us on a path of no return. It is our duty to react before we wake up in a nightmare. And that's why we are convinced it is high time for the Council to pull a brake. Let me emphasize once again that Slovenia condemns the horrific terrorist attack by Hamas on 7th of October, as well as their continuing attacks on Israel. We continue to call for immediate and safe release of all hostages. We feel the pain of their relatives and loved ones. And we thank the leaders of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States for their tireless efforts, and we hope that negotiations they are facilitating will soon bring peace to Gaza and return the hostages home safely. However, it is the responsibility of this Council to maintain international peace and security. We believe that everyone can and should contribute their piece of the puzzle that will eventually bring peace. We believe in complementarity of all efforts, bilateral, regional, or those of the Council. The Council's role is important, and it is indispensable in order to end hostilities, to bring hostages home, to rapidly and safely deliver humanitarian assistance, and to draft a day-after roadmap. Lastly, the Council has a responsibility towards the international community. Its expectations have been clearly expressed through a General Assembly resolution with the overwhelming support of Member States. It has been clearly manifested by citizens across the globe. Their voices are loud and clear. The war needs to stop. The Security Council needs to hear these voices of global consciousness and respond to their demands and pleas. And it all starts with a call for a ceasefire, to end hostilities, to bring hostages home, to bring water and food to starving Palestinians, and to silence and clear the skies over Gaza and Israel. A call addressed to both sides, Israel and Hamas. It is our firm belief that Algeria proposed a balanced text, calling for respect of international humanitarian law and human rights law, addressing all violations committed by both sides of the conflict, and calling for accountability for those violations. It is putting protection of civilians as a civilized norm in the center of our action. We therefore deeply regret that the Council was not able to pass this resolution, which we supported strongly. But we cannot give up. It is our responsibility to continue working towards a consensus in this body for peace in the Middle East. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
La Suisse a voté en
Switzerland
faveur du
voted
projet de
in favor
résolution
of the draft
et
resolution
regrette qu'il n'ait pas été adopté malgré
and
le
regrets
très
that it
large
was not
soutien
adopted
dont il
despite the very
bénéficie parmi
broad
les membres
support it
de ce
enjoys
Conseil.
among the members of this
Je
council.
tiens à remercier les
I would
efforts de
like
la
to
délégation
thank
algérienne
the
dans la
Algerian
recherche de
delegation for its
consensus
efforts in
autour de
building
ce texte,
consensus around this
qui
text,
demande notamment
which
un
calls in
cessez-le-feu
particular
humanitaire
for an
immédiat
immediate
à Gaza et
humanitarian
la
ceasefire
libération
in Gaza
immédiate et
and the
inconditionnelle
immediate and
de tous les
unconditional
otages
release of
retenus
all
captifs à
hostages
Gaza
held captive in
depuis les
Gaza
actes de
since the
terreur
acts of
perpétrés par le
terror
Hamas le 7 octobre.
perpetrated by Hamas on
Depuis la
October 7th.
soumission de la première version de ce texte,
Almost 3
près
weeks
de
have
3
passed
semaines
since
ont
the
passé.
first draft of this text
La
was
Suisse a
submitted.
salué les intenses
Switzerland
négociations
welcomed
qui
the
se
intense
déroulent dans la région
negotiations taking place
et
in
a
the region
souligné
and
qu'il fallait
stressed
leur
the
laisser le
need
temps nécessaires
to give
pour
them the
aboutir à un
necessary time
résultat.
to reach a result.
En même temps,
At the same
nous avons
time,
insisté sur la
we
responsabilité
stress
de
the
ce Conseil
responsibility of
d'agir
this Council to
conformément à
act
son mandat
in
pour le
accordance with its
respect du droit
mandate,
international
for the
humanitaire
respect of
et
international
surtout la
humanitarian
protection
law and
des
especially
civils.
the protection of civilians.
Nous regrettons qu'une condamnation
We
plus
regret
ferme et
that a
explicite des
firmer
actes de
and
terreur du
more
Hamas
explicit
n'ait été
condemnation of
retenue dans la
Hamas's acts of
résolution,
terror was
malgré
not
les
included in the
injonctions de
resolution,
plusieurs membres du Conseil,
despite the
dont la
injunctions of
Suisse.
several council members,
Toutefois,
including Switzerland.
la nécessité de
However,
protéger la population
the
civile à
need to
Gaza
protect the civilian
augmente de
population in
jour en
Gaza
jour.
is
Le
growing
respect du
day
droit
by day.
international humanitaire et des
Respect
droits
for
humains,
international humanitarian
notamment en
law
ce qui
and human
concerne
rights,
la protection des
particularly
civils, doit
as
rester une
regards the protection
priorité
of
de ce
civilians,
Conseil.
must remain
En
a
vertu
priority
des
for this
conventions de
Council.
Genève,
Under the Geneva
l'acheminement de l'aide
Conventions,
humanitaire doit
the
être
delivery
sûr,
of
rapide
humanitarian
et
aid
sans
must be
entrave.
safe,
Nous ne
rapid, and
pouvons admettre
unimpeded.
que des centaines
We
de milliers
cannot
de
allow
civils
hundreds of
assiégés
thousands of
soient laissés en
besieged
proie
civilians
à
to
la
be left prey
famine
to
et aux
famine
épidémies
and
sans garantie
epidemics
de
without
sécurité
adequate
adéquate, que
guarantee
ce
of
soit pour la
security
fourniture de
for the
l'assistance
delivery of
humanitaire et
humanitarian
pour leur
assistance
propre protection.
and for their own
De
protection.
plus, la
In
Suisse est
addition,
très préoccupée par le
Switzerland is
risque
very
d'une opération
concerned about the
militaire
risk of a
d'envergure à Rafah
large-scale
et de
military
l'escalade régionale
operation in
ultérieure
Rafah and the
qu'elle pourrait
subsequent
entraîner.
regional
Le
escalation
projet
it
de
could
résolution
entail.
revêtait
The
ainsi un
draft
caractère
resolution was
préventif
therefore intended
par
as a
rapport à une
preventative
nouvelle
measure
escalade sur
against further
place qui
escalation on
met
the
en
spot,
danger la vie de
which
tous les
would
civils,
endanger the
y
lives of
inclus
all
les otages.
civilians, including the
C'est
hostages.
pourquoi
This
l'appel
is
à un
why the
cessez-le-feu
call for an
humanitaire immédiat à
immediate
Gaza
humanitarian
s'inscrit
ceasefire in
dans la
Gaza
logique
is
de
in
notre
line
engagement
with our
collectif
collective
à respecter
commitment
et faire
to
respecter les
respect and
conventions de
ensure
Genève
respect for the
et le
Geneva
droit
Conventions
international
and
humanitaire
international
en toutes
humanitarian law
circonstances.
in all
La Suisse
circumstances.
reste engagée pour une
Switzerland
action
remains
unifiée du
committed
Conseil en
to
ce sens.
unified
Nous
action by the
rappelons en
Council in
outre
this
que les
direction.
parties sont
We also
tenues de
recall
respecter les deux
that the
précédentes
parties are obliged
résolutions
to respect
de
the
ce
two
Conseil
previous
à
Council
ce sujet.
resolutions on this
Et nous
subject.
rappelons également la
And we
nature
would also recall the
obligatoire des
mandatory
mesures
nature of the
conservatoires que
provisional
la Cour
measures
internationale de
ordered by
justice
the
a
International
ordonnées
Court
le
of
26
Justice
janvier
on
dernier. Je vous
26
remercie.
January. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam
la
Chair,
France remercie
France
l'Algérie
thanks Algeria
d'avoir
for
proposé cette
preparing
résolution.
and proposing this
Elle
resolution.
regrette
It
qu'elle n'ait
regrets
pas pu être adoptée
that the
compte
resolution was
tenu de la
not
situation
adopted given
catastrophique
the
sur le
disastrous
terrain.
situation on the ground.
La libération immédiate
The immediate
et
and
inconditionnelle de tous les
unconditional release
otages,
of all
demandée
hostages,
explicitement par les résolutions
specifically and
2712 et
explicitly requested
2720,
by resolutions
tout comme
2712
le
and
projet, par le
2720
projet
of our
qui vient
Council,
d'être
as
rejeté,
well as the
doit
draft that was just
intervenir sans
rejected,
plus de délai.
should
Il y a urgence
take
à
place
conclure
without
un
further
accord
delay.
sur un
There is
cessez-le-feu
extreme
qui garantisse
urgency
enfin
to,
la
without
protection de
further
tous les
delay,
civils
conclude an
et
agreement on a
l'entrée
ceasefire
massive
that would
et sans
finally guarantee the
entrave
protection of all
de l'aide
civilians and a
d'urgence. Le
massive
bilan humain et
delivery
la
of
situation
emergency
humanitaire à
aid.
Gaza sont
The human
intolérables
toll and the
et les
humanitarian
opérations
situation in Gaza
israéliennes
is
doivent
intolerable,
cesser.
and Israeli
Il est
operations
urgent
must stop.
d'acheminer
It's
massivement
urgent to
l'aide
massively
humanitaire à la
deliver
population de Gaza.
humanitarian
Il
aid
est
to the
impératif
Gaza
d'ouvrir le port
population. It's
d'Ashdod,
imperative
une voie terrestre directe
to
depuis la
open
Jordanie
the
et
Ashdod
tous les points de
port
passage.
and
Il est
open a land
inacceptable
path
que ce
directly
Conseil n'ait
between
toujours pas
Jordan
condamné les
through
actes
all
terroristes
points of
commis par le
passage. It's
Hamas et
also
d'autres groupes terroristes le 7
incomprehensible and
octobre,
unacceptable that this council
ainsi
still has not
que les
condemned the
violences
terrorist
sexuelles
acts committed
utilisées
by
comme arme de
Hamas on
guerre par
7
ces
October
terroristes. La
with other
France le
terrorists
déplore et appelle
and sexual violence
ce
used as a
Conseil à sortir
weapon of war
rapidement de
by
cette
these terrorists.
coupable
We strongly
ambiguïté. Elle
deplore
rappelle son
this situation
attachement
and call upon the
indéfectible
council
à la
to
sécurité
rapidly
d'Israël
clear itself
et elle
of
rappelle
this
aussi sa
ambiguous guilt.
solidarité avec le
France
peuple
reiterates its
israélien après
attachment
ces
to
attaques
Israeli
terroristes. La
security
France continuera de
and
s'engager
will
résolument
continue
dans la voie d'une
to
mobilisation de ce
resolutely be
Conseil
committed
sur
to
l'ensemble
full
des
mobilization of this
volets de la
council
crise,
on all aspects of this
sécuritaire,
crisis, security,
humanitaire, mais
humanitarian,
aussi
and
politique.
also political.
La France rappelle que seule la solution de
We
deux
recall
États est
that
à même de
only a
répondre aux besoins
two-state
de sécurité
solution
d'Israël
can
et du peuple
possibly meet the
israélien,
needs
ainsi qu'aux
of security
aspirations
for
légitimes
Israel and
des
the Israeli people,
Palestiniens
as well as
à un
legitimate
État.
aspiration of the
Elle
Palestinians
implique
to
la
a state.
création d'un
It
État
involves the
palestinien
creation of a
vivant
Palestinian
dans la paix
state
et la
that would live in
sécurité
peace and
aux
security
côtés d'Israël.
alongside
Je vous
Israel.
remercie.
Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Madam President, I wish to begin by expressing our gratitude to the Presidency of Guyana for having convened this meeting to take action on this important resolution on the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. We also express our sincere appreciation to Algeria for the tireless work that led to the tabling of the resolution aimed at ending the totally unacceptable and unbearable suffering of the Palestinian people, the humanitarian catastrophe currently unfolding in Gaza. Madam President, by voting in favor of this Security Council resolution, Mozambique aligns herself with the international community as a whole in its effort that overwhelmingly calls for the immediate cessation of hostilities in the Gaza Strip. We consider it imperative that all parties scrupulously comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and international law, human rights law, in particular with regard to the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructures. We strongly call for the total and full compliance with the provisional measures laid down by the order of the International Court of Justice within the scope of Articles 2 and 3 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, handed down on January 26, 2024. Throughout history, we had our share of painful experience with war and armed conflict. It is on this basis and on the dictates of the laws of war that we embrace that Mozambique firmly opposes the forced displacement of the Palestinian civilian population, women and children in particular. In that connection, we strongly appeal for the full implementation of the United Nations Security Council resolutions 2712 of 2023 and 2720 also of 2023. In the same vein, Mozambique demands the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, as well as a guarantee of humanitarian access to meet the medical needs of all hostages. Mr. President, Madam President, we urge the international community and the Security Council in particular to continue working tirelessly together towards achieving peace and stability in the region based on a two-state solution for the people of Palestine and Israel. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. The Republic of Korea voted in favor of the resolution proposed by Algeria, considering the urgent need for a humanitarian ceasefire to end the suffering of civilians in Gaza. Right now in Rafah, where more than half of the entire population of Gaza is densely packed, people are panicking at a looming catastrophe that may be caused by a full-scale ground operation. The Republic of Korea could not ignore the possibility of another humanitarian calamity that will lead to a huge number of fatalities. Nonetheless, we adhere to our position that the heinous terrorist attacks by Hamas on the 7th of October is the direct cause of the current disaster in Gaza. Thus, it is regrettable that a clear and unified condemnation of the deplorable terrorist acts perpetrated by Hamas was missing in the draft resolution. Madam President, the Republic of Korea takes note that serious negotiations among key stakeholders, namely Egypt, Qatar, US, and Israel, are vigorously ongoing on the ground to achieve the long overdue release of the hostages. We express our strong support and appreciation for these efforts. The Republic of Korea will continue to engage in Council deliberations actively and constructively to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza, as well as the realization of the two-state solution. I thank you.
Representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. It has been over 4 months of devastation, hostilities, and suffering since Hamas' horrifying acts of terror against Israel. We are witnessing an alarming escalation of violence and unimaginable humanitarian catastrophe. The situation on the ground is only worsening as each day goes by. Particularly, the situation in Rafah is deeply concerning. Japan appreciates the ongoing tireless diplomatic efforts led by US and other countries towards the release of hostages, improving the humanitarian situation, and calming down the situation as soon as possible. Japan believes that humanitarian ceasefire needs to be realized promptly in such a way to ensure a conducive environment for sufficient humanitarian assistance activities, as well as to lead to the release of the remaining hostages, therefore resulting in realization of a sustainable ceasefire. Based on this position, we call on all the parties concerned to act immediately from a humanitarian viewpoint. In this vein, Japan voted in favor of this draft resolution. We would like to express our gratitude to Algeria for their efforts to coordinate various positions among the Council members. At the same time, in efforts to ensure a more fair and balanced text, the resolution should have included a condemnation of Hamas terrorist attacks, which the Security Council has so far failed to speak out. Though we couldn't agree on a resolution which all the Council members can support, we are all engaging seriously to stop the violence. This Council should be a place to explore and find a peace and security jointly, not a place to aim for finger pointing. Japan will continue to work constructively with other Council members to find a path forward for peace and stability in the region. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. Malta also thanks Algeria for their measured and constructive approach as penholders throughout the negotiations. Malta voted in favor of this draft, and we unequivocally reiterate our call for a permanent ceasefire. It is therefore regrettable that the use of the veto prevents this Council from calling for an end to this conflict. We also believe that the Council has provided the ongoing negotiations taking place on the ground the necessary space and time. However, regrettably, we still find ourselves on the precipice of another wave of hostilities. This will undoubtedly have catastrophic consequences on the civilian population in Rafah, an area already designated as a safe zone. We also reject and denounce any forced displacement of the Palestinian civilian population from and within Gaza. Such actions amount to grave breaches of international law. The severely deteriorating humanitarian conditions and the threat of famine within Gaza are extremely troubling and need to be urgently addressed. Israel is required to facilitate the full, rapid, safe, and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid into Gaza. At the same time, UNRWA remains essential to ensure an effective humanitarian response. The broader regional situation also continues to be deeply worrying. Under these circumstances, the full and immediate implementation of Security Council Resolutions 2712 and 2720 is now more pressing than ever. Let us be clear, this Council has the duty and responsibility to make sure that its decisions are respected. We also echo the call for the remaining hostages to be immediately, safely, and unconditionally released, and we call on this Council to denounce the terrorist acts of October 7th. In closing, President, Malta underlines its unwavering commitment to a comprehensive peace based on the two-state solution. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. We want to see the fighting in Gaza end as soon as possible in a way that never again allows Hamas to carry out the appalling terrorist attacks against Israel we saw on the 7th of October last year. Palestinian civilians are facing a devastating humanitarian crisis. We're particularly worried about the situation in Rafah, where a military operation could have appalling consequences for civilians sheltering there with nowhere else to go. Ongoing negotiations are critical to secure the release of the hostages held in Gaza. We are calling for an immediate suspension in fighting to get aid in and hostages out, leading to a permanent, sustainable ceasefire. That means the release of all hostages, the formation of a new Palestinian government for the West Bank and Gaza, accompanied by an international support package, removing Hamas's capacity to launch attacks against Israel, Hamas no longer in charge of Gaza, and a political horizon which provides a credible and irreversible pathway towards a two-state solution. President, we welcome the efforts of our Algerian colleagues on this resolution, and we regret that some of our proposals were not taken on board. Simply calling for a ceasefire, as this resolution does, will not make it happen. Indeed, as it could endanger the hostage negotiations, it could actually make a ceasefire less likely. The way to stop the fighting and potentially stop it from restarting is to begin with a pause to get hostages out and aid in. That is what we are calling for. It could end the fighting now. We will continue to work for a stop to fighting, a humanitarian response at scale, the release of all hostages, and the delivery of the two sovereign states of Israel and Palestine that ensures peace, security, and justice for both countries. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Madam President, the delegation of Sierra Leone would like to thank Algeria for proposing and facilitating efforts to agree to a resolution that would have inter alia led to an immediate ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. We further thank the Algerian delegation for leading a reasonable, transparent, and inclusive process. Sierra Leone voted in favor of the draft resolution because of the imperative for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. The Security Council is mandated to act promptly and effectively in order to maintain international peace and security. The Council has had its attention called to the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza and for it to act under Article 99 of the UN Charter by the Secretary General. Some members of the Security Council I've had the opportunity to visit both Rafah crossing from the Egyptian border and Israel, including representatives of the delegation of Sierra Leone. The assessment therefrom has been that only a humanitarian ceasefire will put an end to the unbearable killings in Gaza, and certainly the looming and unthinkable catastrophe in Rafah. Sierra Leone appreciates and commends member states embarking on diplomatic engagement with parties to the conflict to secure a prolonged pause to the hostilities. But while we do so, we remain worried that reaching a meaningful conclusion in practical terms takes time, a luxury that cannot be afforded by the suffering Palestinian people, the families of the hostages, and the hostages themselves. The other main organs of the United Nations have acted timeously and effectively in this tragic conflict. The UN General Assembly has adopted resolutions ES 1021 and ES 1022, with the overwhelming majority demanding in the latter an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. The Secretary General of the UN invoked Article 99 of the UN Charter, last used over half a century ago, to warn us in this council of the humanitarian catastrophe we now see in Gaza. As council members, we were urged to demand an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. The International Court of Justice has acted promptly and rightly when called upon to do so by South Africa. Following the request for indication of provisional measures, the ICJ, in the 26 January 2024 order, in the application of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in the Gaza Strip, South Africa versus Israel, inter alia specifically ordered, and I quote, that the state of Israel shall take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, end of quote. The court deemed it necessary to emphasize that all parties to the conflict in the Gaza Strip are bound by international humanitarian law. It expressed its grave concern that the fate of the hostages abducted during the attack in Israel on 7 October 2023 and held since then by Hamas and other armed groups, and calls for their immediate and unconditional release. The ICJ further reminded the parties that the provisional measures ordered under Article 41 of the ICJ statute have binding effect and thus create international legal obligations for any party to whom the provisional measures are addressed. Sierra Leone is of the view that in the absence of any prima facie change in the current perilous humanitarian conditions prevailing in Gaza, coupled with the continuing perpetuation of the hostage situation following the 26 January 2024 order of the ICJ, the UN Security Council is now more than ever compelled to act, to use the myriad of tools available to us as a council to save human lives and put a check on the mounting death toll and inordinate destruction of civilian objects. Madam President, it is extremely worrisome that after over 130 days in the conflict, a draft resolution calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, demanding the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, rejecting forced displacement of the Palestinians, reiterating the call for full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access into Gaza, and the optimal political solution of a two-state solution could not be adopted, which we deeply regret. At this stage, with the immense suffering, death, and anguish in Gaza, the Security Council must not relent until a complete halt to the continuing hostilities in Gaza Strip and in the West Bank is achieved. To do otherwise is to accept passively the prevalent criticisms of dysfunctionality of this council. Meanwhile, the reality in Gaza is that of famine-like conditions, malnutrition, displacement, and the spread of infectious diseases, and the potential for spillover of the conflict in the wider region. Our failure to act extinguishes hope. The hope that 1.3 million Palestinians in Rafah have supplicated to us. And beyond this, the hope that humanity has placed in us as members to deliver on the Council's mandate. This must awaken our resolve to act. In closing, Madam President, Sierra Leone sincerely looks forward to not only having a positive outcome from the ongoing diplomatic negotiations being mediated by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, but also as a Security Council will have a product that will call for full and unconditional humanitarian ceasefire and the release of all hostages. This, we hope, will lead to an end in the fighting and alleviate the humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Señora Presidenta,
Madam Chair,
agradezco
I
a
would like to
Argelia
thank
por el
Algeria
proyecto de resolución
for the draft
presentado.
resolution that was
El
introduced.
Ecuador ha votado
Ecuador
a favor del mismo
voted in
debido a
favor
que
of it,
considera que el Consejo
given
debe
that it believes that the
pronunciarse
Council
frente a
needs to
una
take a
situación
stand
humanitaria
on the
en
humanitarian
constante
situation,
deterioro
which is constantly
con miles
unraveling
de víctimas
with
inocentes.
thousands of innocent
El
victims.
proyecto que hemos
The
votado no es
draft that
perfecto,
we just
ni
voted
se han
on was not
incluido en él
perfect
todos los
and
puntos que
included in it
consideramos
all the issues
apropiados,
that we think were
pero ha sido
appropriate,
presentado
but it
luego de un
was
proceso de
presented after
negociación
a
e
negotiations
incluye elementos
process
necesarios
that
ante una
included the
situación que se agrava
necessary elements
minuto
about
a
a
minuto.
situation which is
En lo principal,
deteriorating minute
el
minute
texto que
by minute.
acabamos de votar demanda un cese al
Mainly,
fuego
it
humanitario
requests a
que
humanitarian
permitiría
ceasefire that
aliviar
would
la
make it
situación de la
possible to
población
alleviate
civil,
the
al
situation
tiempo
for
que
the
exige
civilian
la
population.
liberación
And it
inmediata
also
e
demands the
incondicional
immediate and
de todos los
unconditional release
rehenes
of all
y deplora
hostages.
la
And it
violencia contra
deplores
civiles
the
y
violence
todos los
against
actos de
civilians and
terrorismo,
all acts of
incluyendo
terrorism, including
implícitamente los
implicitly
execrables actos
the
cometidos por
horrific
Hamas
acts
en octubre
committed by
pasado.
Hamas in
Sin
October of
embargo,
last year. However,
cabe mencionar que el Ecuador,
it's worth mentioning
al igual que
that
varios miembros
Ecuador,
del
like
Consejo,
several members of
ha
the Council,
requerido
insistently
insistentemente
required
que el texto contenga
that the
una
text
condena
have
explícita
an
a
explicit
los actos
condemnation of
terroristas
the
de Hamas.
terrorist
Lamentamos
actions of
que
Hamas,
no se
and
haya
we
incluido en el
regret
texto
that it
esta
was not
condena,
included in
pues
the text.
consideramos
That
que es
condemnation was not
indispensable
there.
señalar
However, we think
claramente
it's
las
important to clearly
responsabilidades que
signal
son evidentes
the
en el presente
responsibility
para luego
that
demandar
is
también
evident
las
of all those
responsabilidades
present, and
que
also
se
point to the
conocerán en el
responsibilities
futuro.
that will be seen
El
in
Ecuador,
future.
señora Presidenta,
Ecuador, Madam Chair,
lamenta que en
regrets
esta ocasión
at this
no se
time
haya podido adoptar
that
una
it was not
resolución
possible to
y
adopt a
continuará
resolution, and it will
trabajando
continue
para que el
working
Consejo pueda
so that the
pronunciarse
Council
y
can
actuar
take a stance and
efectivamente
act
mediante
effectively
una adopción
through
exitosa. Muchas
successful
gracias.
adoption. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Госпожа
Madam
председатель,
President,
уважаемые коллеги,
distinguished colleagues,
сегодня мы
today
стали
we
свидетелями
have borne
очередной
witness to yet
черной
another
страницы в истории Совета
dark
Безопасности
chapter
ООН.
in the history of the United Nations Security
Ее
Council.
вновь написала
This was
делегация Соединенных Штатов,
yet again written by the
которая
United States
преследует всю
delegation,
ту
the
же
U.S.
цель
delegation which continues to
покрывать
pursue the
своего
same
ближайшего
objective,
ближневосточного
to provide
союзника
cover for its
и
closest Middle
максимально
East
тянуть время,
ally, and
чтобы
to
он
drag
смог
out
завершить
time
свои
to the
бесчеловечные планы в
greatest
отношении
possible
Газы,
extent for them to be able to
а
carry out their
именно
inhumane
выдавить из сектора
plans
палестинцев и
against Gaza,
полностью зачистить
specifically to
анклав,
expel the Palestinians
причем
from
в прямом смысле,
the strip
превратив
and
его
to
в
completely
необитаемую территорию.
cleanse the strip, essentially and quite literally transforming it into an uninhabitable
В этих условиях в политических кругах
territory.
Израиля не
Under these
стесняются рассуждать в
circumstances, there are
категориях,
open
которые
discussions in
полностью
political
включают
Israeli
двухгосударственное
political
решение.
circles about categories which completely rule out the two-state solution.
Вновь
Once
противопоставив
again,
призывы
having
прекратить
pitted
бойню в
calls
Газе и
against
обеспечить
for calling
прекращение
an
огня,
end to the carnage in Gaza,
требованием осудить
against
действия
demands to
ХАМАС,
condemn the actions of
наши
Hamas.
американские коллеги
In doing so, our
лицемерно
U.S.
молчали о
colleagues have
том,
once
что
again hypocritically
18
remained silent
октября
about
именно
the
они
fact that on the
уже
18th October,
заветировали
they, having already
бразильский
vetoed
проект
the
резолюции
Brazilian
с таким
draft
осуждением.
resolution with this condemnation.
Алжирский проект был
The Algerian
способен
draft
преломить эту
was capable
ситуацию
of
и
reversing
остановить
this
уничтожение
situation,
палестинцев в Газе.
of ending the annihilation of
К сожалению,
Palestinians in
очередное, уже
Gaza.
четвертое по счету
Unfortunately,
вето
the
Соединенных
latest,
Штатов
the
этому
now
помешало и
fourth
обрекло
U.S.
на гибель
veto
новые тысячи мирных
prevented this from
газовиков.
happening and doomed the fates of another thousands of peaceful citizens of Gaza.
Однако все должны понимать, что
However,
такой результат
everybody
это
needs
не
to
провал работы
understand
Совета
that this
Безопасности
result
ООН,
is not the
который сегодня
failure in
был
the work of the UN
фактически
Security
един,
Council, which today was
а
effectively
деструктивная
united.
линия
Rather,
единственного
this
его
is the
члена Соединенных
pernicious
Штатов.
policy of a single member of the Security
Вся
Council, namely the
полнота
United States.
ответственности за
Full
последствия ложится на
responsibility for the
Вашингтон, как бы
consequences
он
of
ни
this
старался
lies with Washington,
от нее
regardless of
увильнуть,
its
рассказывая о
attempts
своих
to elude
важных
this
посреднических
responsibility,
усилиях.
expatiating on its quote-unquote important mediation efforts.
Каким бы горьким ни было
Regardless
послевкусие
of how
сегодняшнего голосования,
bitter
мы не
the
настроены
aftertaste
опускать
of
руки.
today's meeting may be, we have no intention of
Требование
throwing in the
Совета
towel.
Безопасности
The
ООН к
demand from the
сторонам
UN
о
Security
немедленном
Council for the
прекращении огня
parties to
остается императивным.
immediately adopt a ceasefire
Без него
remains
любой продукт Совета
imperative.
будет лишен
Absent this, any
практического
council
смысла.
product will be
Все
devoid
мы
of
имели
practical
возможность убедиться
purpose. We all
в
had an
этом на примере
opportunity to see
беззубых
this
гуманитарных резолюций
based on
по
the
Газе,
example of the
ранее
toothless
принятых
humanitarian
Советом.
resolutions on Gaza that the Council
Они
had
все так
previously
и остались
adopted.
на бумаге,
And these
потому что,
remained
как мы и
letters on
предупреждали,
paper because, as
в
we
условиях активных
warned,
боевых действий
amid
невозможно ни
circumstances
оказание
of active
гуманитарной помощи,
hostilities, it is
ни
impossible to
мониторинг
deliver humanitarian
гуманитарной
assistance
паузы.
or to monitor humanitarian pauses.
Что касается
Now,
американского
turning
текста,
to the
который
US
ранее
text,
сегодня
which
так
previously
активно
today
рекламировала
was so
постоянный
proactively
представитель Соединенных Штатов,
championed by the United States representative,
то, насколько нам
as far as
известно,
we are aware,
он даже не был
this
еще
text
официально
has not even been
распространен в Совете,
officially circulated at the Security
не говоря
Council,
уже о том,
not to
что
mention
не
the
было
fact
никакого
that
его
there
содержательного
was
обсуждения.
no comprehensive or meaningful discussion thereof.
Поэтому пока
For
все
this
это
reason,
выглядит как
for now,
очевидные
this all
спойлеры,
looks like
призванные
further
отвлечь
spoilers, which are
внимание от
designed to
очередного
detract attention from
постыдного вето
the
Соединенных Штатов,
latest shameful veto exercise by the
наложенного на остро
US,
необходимую
veto
резолюцию
on
о
a
прекращении
critically
огня в Газе.
significant resolution for a ceasefire in Gaza.
Призываем
We
членов
call
Совета
on
не
the
верить
membership of the Security
лукавым
Council
и
not to be
лицемерным
misled by the
увещеваниям о том,
duplicated
что
admonitions
надо
that there
подождать
is a
еще
need to
немного.
wait just a little bit longer.
Совет
The
Безопасности
United
и весь мир
Nations
ждали
Security
5
Council and the
месяцев,
world waited
и
for
каждый
5
час
months.
этого
And
ожидания
with
приносит
each
новые
passing
человеческие жертвы.
hour that we wait, there are more and more human
Американский проект не
victims. The
содержит,
US draft does not
подчеркиваю,
contain, I
не
emphasize
содержит
this,
призывов к
does not
немедленному
contain a
прекращению
call for
огня
an
в Газе.
immediate ceasefire in Gaza.
В нем идет
The
речь
text
только о
refers
временном,
only to a
да и
temporary,
то, когда
and
сложатся
even
условия.
this when the conditions are ripe.
Так что никакой реальной
So there is no
альтернативой
real
изометированному сегодня
alternative
Соединенными
to
Штатами
the
алжирскому
Algerian
проекту
draft resolution which the
американское
US
детище
vetoed.
не является
This
и являться не может.
brainchild is no viable alternative and
Это
cannot
всего
be
лишь
any
еще
viable
одна
alternative to that.
недобросовестная
This is yet
попытка
another
Вашингтона откинуть время
bad faith attempt by Washington to drag out
в
the
интересах
time
Израиля
for
и
the
дать ему
purposes
возможность
of advancing
окончательно
Israel's
решить
benefit,
палестинский
interest,
вопрос.
and allowing it to definitively resolve the Palestinian
Наша
question.
общая задача
Our shared
помешать
objective
этим
is to
замыслам и
prevent
добиться
this
справедливого
from
мира
taking
между
place and to
Израилем и
achieve a
Палестиной
just peace
на
between the
основе решений Совета
Palestinians and Israel on the
Безопасности
basis of
Генеральной
Security Council
Ассамблеи ООН.
resolutions and General Assembly resolutions.
Давайте вместе
Let us
решать, возможно,
resolve this
когда-то и у
together,
наших
and
американских коллег
perhaps our US
наконец-то
colleagues will at
проснется
some
совесть.
point have their conscience awakened.
I thank
Thank you.
the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. سيد الرئيس.
Madam President,
بداية
allow
أود
me
أن
at the outset
أعرب
to
عن
express
امتناني
my
لجميع
appreciation
أعضاء
to
هذا
all
المجلس
the members of the Security Council
لمشاركتهم
for
البناءة
constructively participating
طوال عملية
in the
التفاوض.
negotiations.
كما أشكر
Allow me
جميع
also to
الدول
thank all
التي
states
صوتت
that voted for
لصالح مشروع القرار
and not against
وحتى
the
تلك
draft
التي
resolution.
لم تعترض
I
عن
also thank
اعتماد
those who
هذا
abstained,
المشروع. هذا المشروع
because this
الذي
draft
يطالب
resolution
أساساً
calls mainly
بوقف إطلاق النار في غزة.
for a ceasefire in Gaza.
لقد كان مشروع القرار هذا
The draft resolution
يحمل رسالة قوية إلى
would have sent
الفلسطينيين
a strong message to Palestinians,
مفادها أن العالم
saying that the world
لا يقف صامتا
is not
أمام
standing idly by
محنتهم.
their suffering.
لكن ومع الأسف
And unfortunately,
مجلس الأمن
the Security Council
فشل مرة
failed
أخرى
once again
فشل في أن يرتقي
to rise to the
إلى
calls
مستوى
and
نداءات
aspirations
الشعوب
of peoples of the world.
وتطلعاتها. هذا الفشل الذي
This failure
لا يعفيه
does not
من
absolve the
القيام
Security Council of
بالمسؤولية
shouldering its responsibilities.
ولا يعفيه
This failure
المجموعة
does
الدولية
not absolve the international community
من
of its
إجابتها
obligations
تجاه الشعب الفلسطيني الأعزل،
vis-à-vis the unarmed Palestinian people.
ولا يعفي
This
سلطات
failure
الاحتلال
does not absolve the occupation power
من واجب تنفيذ
of its obligation
التدابير
to implement
التحفظية
the precautionary
لمحكمة العدل
measures
الدولية.
ordered by the International Court of Justice.
لقد حان الوقت
It is high
لكي
time for the
يتوقف
aggression
العدوان
to end.
ونتمكن
It is high
من
time
تسهيل
for humanitarian
وصول
assistance
المساعدة
to be
الإنسانية
delivered across
إلى
Gaza
جميع أحياء غزة. من الواضح أن
It is clear
قرارين
that resolutions
27/12
2712 and
و27/20
2720
لم يحققا
did not achieve
النتائج المرجوة،
their objectives.
وأن
It
المساعدات
is clear
لا تلبي
that
الحد
assistance
الأدنى
did not meet the
للفلسطينيين.
basic needs of the Palestinian people.
علينا أن نعترف
We have to
أن وقف
acknowledge
إطلاق النار
that only a
وحده
ceasefire,
وقف إطلاق النار
only
وحده
a
هو
ceasefire
ما يحقق
can
الهدف
achieve
المنشود.
the desired objective.
سيد الرئيس،
Madam President,
إن الوضع الحالي
the current
يفرض
situation
على الجميع
requires
مثلما
everyone,
أكده
as
رئيس
stressed by
الجمهورية
the
السيد
Algerian
عبد المجيد
President,
تبون،
His Excellency Abdelmajid
العمل
Tebboune,
العمل على إعلام مبادئ
to
ومقاصد
work
الأمم المتحدة
on putting the
وتوفير
purposes and principles
الحماية
of the United
اللازمة للشعب
Nations
الفلسطيني
first, to provide the
ووضع
necessary
حد
protection to the Palestinian
للظلم
people
التاريخي
and to put an end
المسلط
to their
عليه.
historic injustice.
سيد الرئيس،
Madam President,
إن شعوب منطقتنا
the people of our region
كانت
have
ولا
always
تزال
looked
تنظر
up
إلى مجلس
to the
الأمن
Security Council
باعتباره عنوان
as the
الشرعية
source
الدولية،
of international legitimacy.
لكنه
However,
مع الأسف
and unfortunately,
خذلها مرة
the
أخرى.
Security Council has failed them once
إن
again.
رسالتنا اليوم لكم
Our message to you
هي
today
أنه على المجموعة الدولية
is that the international community
أن تتجاوب مع مطالب
should respond
وقف
to the
القتل
calls
الذي
for ending the
يستهدف
killing of
الفلسطينيين،
Palestinians
وذلك من خلال
by calling
المطالبة بوقف إطلاق
for
النار
an
فوراً،
immediate ceasefire,
وأنه على من يعرقل ذلك
all those
أن يراجع
impeding such calls
سياسته
should review
وحساباته،
their policies and
لأن
their
القرارات
calculations,
الخاطئة لليوم
because wrong decisions today
تحسب
will have a cost
منطقتنا
on our region
والعالم
and our
نتائجها
world tomorrow.
غدا عنفا
And this cost will be
وعدم
violence
استقرار.
and instability.
فأسألوا أنفسكم
So ask yourselves,
وضمائركم
Examine your conscience.
عن نتائج قراراتكم.
What will your decisions
وكيف
today cause?
سيحكم عليكم
How will history judge you?
التاريخ. سيد الرئيس،
Madam President,
قبل أن أختم
before I conclude,
أقول للجميع
I would like to tell everyone
أننا سندفن
that we
أننا
will
سندفن
bury
شهدائنا
our martyrs
هذا المساء
this evening
برفح،
in Rafah,
بغزة،
in Gaza,
بكل فلسطين،
in all Palestine,
وأن الجزائر
and that Algeria
ستعود غدا
will return
باسم
tomorrow
الأمة العربية
on behalf of the Arab world,
وباسم الأمة
on
الإسلامية
behalf of Muslim countries,
وباسم أحرار
and on
العالم.
behalf of all the free people in the world.
ومعنا أرواح الآلاف
Powered by the souls
من
of
الأبرياء
thousands of innocent
التي
people
أزهقها
killed
المحتل الإسرائيلي
by the Israeli occupation
من دون حساب
with no
ولا
accountability
عقاب.
whatsoever.
ستعود الجزائر
Algeria will return
لتدق
to knock
أبواب مجلس
on the
الأمن
doors
مرة
of the
أخرى
Security Council once again
وتطالب
to call
بوقف
for
حمام
putting
الدم
an end
في
to the
فلسطين.
bloodshed in Palestine.
ولن نتوقف
We will not stop
حتى يتحمل هذا المجلس
this council
كامل
shoulders
مسؤولياته
its responsibilities in full
ويفرض وقفا
and imposes
إطلاق النار فوريا.
an immediate ceasefire.
فإن لنا نفوسا لا تمل
We will never tire
وعزيمة
and we will
لا تخل.
never stop.
وشكرا.
Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Algeria for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Guyana. Colleagues, Guyana is disappointed that this council has once again been unable to deliver a ceasefire for the people of Gaza. A ceasefire is the difference between life and death for the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and others trapped in the war zone that Gaza has become. The delegation of Algeria has approached the tabling of this resolution with great patience, transparency, and inclusivity. They have listened to all sides, acquiescing to requests for additional time to be given to other efforts underway. It has been almost 3 weeks since the draft was circulated, and we still find ourselves at square one. In that time, almost 2,000 more Palestinians were killed in Gaza, another 2,000 more injured. In those 3 weeks, every aspect of life in Gaza has gotten worse. Internal displacement has increased, with a serious crisis underway in Rafah. Food insecurity continued to worsen, with the latest Integrated Food Security and Nutrition Phase Classification, IPC, report stating that Gaza now has the highest share of persons facing devastating levels of acute food insecurity that the IPC has ever classified for any given area or country. The humanitarian situation has been described as increasingly severe. Humanitarian access is extremely limited, and people's desperation has led them to looting aid trucks to secure a morsel of food. The population is in dire straits. The most vulnerable among them, including children, the elderly, and people with underlying conditions, are especially vulnerable to malnutrition. And all of this is happening in freezing temperatures. In that time, we have also seen a further hardening of positions for the worse. For example, we have heard the determination of the Israeli government to proceed with a ground operation in Rafah, despite the strong urgings to the contrary by many of its friends and partners and others in the international community. We know what a ground operation in Rafah would mean for the people who were driven there by the Israeli Defense Force. The ICJ orders of 26th of January are being completely ignored, as though there is no obligation to adhere to them. UN personnel are continuing to operate in Gaza under these extremely dangerous circumstances, with unprecedented numbers of them killed since 7th of October. Deconfliction mechanisms are not being respected, so everyone is at risk and nowhere is safe. Dear colleagues, what else needs to happen to act for the people in Gaza? How many more lives must be lost? How many more must be maimed? How many more? We need a ceasefire now. Resolutions 2712 and 2720 cannot be fully implemented if there is no ceasefire. The longer we take to agree on the need for a ceasefire, the longer this Council will be seen as being complicit in what is taking place in Gaza. To be clear, Guyana also calls for the release of all hostages taken on October 7th and Palestinians unlawfully detained in Israeli prisons without trial. Though progress has been stalled for decades, the two-state solution still remains the best option for a permanent and lasting resolution of the Palestinian question. The current situation in Gaza puts the two-state solution at great risk, especially given the rhetoric from some Israeli government officials. Guyana calls on this Council to act now for Gaza and for the future of both Palestine and Israel. A peaceful and stable Israel depends on a peaceful and stable Palestine. The two are not mutually exclusive. And a peaceful Palestine and Israel is crucial for lasting peace and stability of the Middle East region. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Madam President, we thank you and your friendly country, Guyana, for your leadership of the Security Council. We thank Algeria for all its efforts and its statement that my brother Ammar delivered a few minutes ago in bringing forth the draft resolution on behalf of the Arab group that has just been voted regarding the grave situation that continues to be faced by the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip as Israel, the occupying power, carries on with its genocidal war. We also thank the 13 members of the Security Council who voted in favor of the draft, and we thank you also for your intense engagement with the Arab group led by our brother, the Ambassador of Algeria, during the course of the last 3 weeks, negotiating in good faith of trying to save the Palestinian people's lives in the Gaza Strip and not to allow the looming catastrophe flying over our heads in having a further catastrophe on the Gaza Strip. We sincerely thank you for that effort, for your principled position, and for your determination that a ceasefire has to be demanded implemented now to save lives, to save the Gaza Strip, to save the 1.5 million Palestinians in the Rafah district. This draft resolution was brought to the Council precisely because Israel persists with the onslaught, persists with every single grave breach it has been committing, despite the near unanimous calls by the international community for a ceasefire, and despite the ICJ provisional measures ordered to Israel to cease all acts of genocide and incitement to genocide, and to ensure humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people, who every day are facing death and destruction and the torment of starvation and repeated forced displacement. It has been nearly 3 weeks since I last addressed the Council following the court's order appealing for action to be taken to ensure the implementation of the provisional measures, to ensure a ceasefire that would protect the Palestinian people and avert the further ravaging of their lives by the Israeli onslaught. But our appeals have regrettably been to no avail. Between our last council session on the 31st of January and today, the casualty toll has risen from 26,000 Palestinians killed by the Israeli occupying forces to now almost 30,000 people killed and more than 69,000 people injured. This means that in just the past 20 days alone, Israel has killed nearly 4,000 more Palestinian children, women, and men in just 20 days. This is a deplorable consequence of inaction. It means more than 200 Palestinians killed every day. It means that by the time this Security Council session ends, more than 25 Palestinians will have been killed. It means more babies will be murdered, wounded, amputated, and orphaned. More children will die of hunger and hypothermia and disease. It means the continued threat of the further forced displacement of families, the looming danger of a mass expulsion or worse, slaughter of the nearly 1.5 million people in Rafah who have nowhere to flee, no protection whatsoever. It means the continued deprivation of the entire population of Gaza, left without food, water, medicine, and shelter, essential to alleviate suffering and ensure survival. It means that the human lives that could have been spared and saved are instead being forsaken to Israel's genocidal war machine, deliberately, knowingly, by those who oppose a ceasefire. We all know this. We know the staggering figures. We have heard the warning from the Secretary General, the heads of all UN agencies on the ground, dozens of independent special rapporteurs and humanitarian and human rights agencies the world over. We have seen it with our own eyes in pictures and videos that have seared and stained our collective conscience and broken our hearts and our humanity. In the face of Israel's brazen violation of the ICJ order, the court sent another warning, issued another decision on 16 February, reminding Israel that it is bound to fully comply with its obligations under the Genocide Convention and all the provisional measures ordered by the court on 26 January. The court also had to remind Israel that its obligations are immediate and should be effective. The call for ceasefire should have been agreed to long time ago. What threshold needs to be crossed for this council to finally demand a ceasefire? What could be more serious than the crime than genocide? History, as my brother Ammar said, is going to judge the council harshly. It is already doing so, impairing its credibility and authority in the eyes of people all over the world, perhaps irreparably. But we will not be complacent in this inaction. We have a duty to our people to seek every possible pathway to bring an end to the slaughter, an end to the trauma and terror, an end to the threats to expel them from their land. We will not be silent, and we will act with every legitimate means to uphold our sacred obligations to defend and protect our people and to pursue justice for them. That is why we have come back to the Security Council over and over again, imploring it to act to protect our people. That is why we will not relent in seeking accountability, calling on the Council, the General Assembly, and all states to act in line with the Charter and all obligations under international law without selectivity, without exception. We will not stop demanding accountability for the war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide that Israel is perpetrating against the Palestinian people. But accountability must move beyond words in these chambers. It must mean real consequences for the occupying power for its criminal behavior. To this end, I just have returned around midnight last night from The Hague, where the state of Palestine stood before the ICJ, appealing to the court for justice after more than 75 years of Nakba, 56 years of belligerent occupation, 17 years of blockade, and nearly 140 days of vindictive, punitive siege and massacres perpetrated by Israel in Gaza, which is a genocide. What crimes has Israel not committed yet? We have gone to the court along with an unprecedented number of countries to confront the Israeli impunity that has made life a living hell for the Palestinian people, appealing for an immediate and complete end to this illegal colonial occupation and apartheid regime, the root cause of all the ills our people are suffering, including this genocidal war. The court has undertaken its solemn duties, acting swiftly both in response to the case brought by South Africa against Israel under the Genocide Convention and in response to the General Assembly's request for advisory opinion, which we hope will be a true turning point in the quest for accountability and for justice for the Palestinian people. When will the Security Council finally undertake its solemn duties? When will the Council act to demand the ceasefire that has been demanded by the rest of the international community majority for months now? The veto of this draft resolution is not only regrettable after weeks of consultations with every single Council member, and after endless patience by the State of Palestine, the Arab states, and nearly the entire international community that for months have demanded a ceasefire. It is absolutely reckless and dangerous against shielding Israel, even as it commits the most shocking crimes, while exposing millions of innocent Palestinian civilians to its wrath and more untold horrors. It is not Israel that should be protected by the veto. It is Palestinian children, women, and men who must be protected by this council acting now. Only with a ceasefire can we give a chance for life, for Resolution 2712 and 2720 to be implemented, as the President of the Security Council has indicated correctly. Ceasefire would allow these two resolutions to be implemented for humanitarian assistance to reach the millions of desperate people in need, for UNRWA and other UN agencies to deliver life-saving aid, and a chance for our collective efforts to chart a path for justice and peace. And as long as the Council fails to demand a ceasefire, it will be considered not only derelict in its duties, but an enabler of the most horrific crimes we are witnessing in these days in Gaza. The message given today to Israel with this veto is that it can continue to get away with murder. Israel cannot and should not and will not get away with it. We will not allow it. This veto does not absolve Israel of its obligations, nor of those who shield it. Not here in the Security Council, not in the ICJ, and not anywhere. Even if the Security Council continues to shirk its responsibilities, to be obstructed by the veto of a permanent member over and over, the other organs of the international system are upholding their responsibilities. And one day or another, Palestinian children will not be viewed as a demography threat, but as children with a right to life and to fulfill their hopes and dreams. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. Since October 7th, this Council has voted upon numerous resolutions constructed around the same flawed theme, the concept of a ceasefire. This word is constantly mentioned in the Security Council, in the General Assembly, and by UN officials and agencies, as if it is a silver bullet, a magical solution to all of the region's problems. For the past 137 days, the only solution discussed on the international stage is this absurd notion of a ceasefire. Will a ceasefire bring home the hostages? Will a ceasefire eliminate Hamas? Will a ceasefire disarm Hezbollah, the Houthis, and all the other Iranian terrorist proxies in our region? Will a ceasefire end the genocidal ambitions of Palestinian terror groups aiming for Israel's annihilation? We're still waiting for President Abbas to condemn the October 7th massacre. What exactly will this silver bullet ceasefire achieve? A ceasefire achieves one thing and one thing only: the survival of Hamas. Exactly the opposite of how it's portrayed. A ceasefire is a death sentence for many more Israelis and Gazans. Supporting a ceasefire means supporting the survival of jihadist terrorists that will continue butchering Israelis and endlessly spilling the blood of innocents. There is a reason, dear colleagues, that the ICJ unanimously and rightly rejected South Africa's attempt to undermine Israel's right to defend itself by calling for a ceasefire. The very idea that Israel would be denied this fundamental right, while Hamas would be free to continue its terror and hold hostages, is morally unthinkable, because as you know, Hamas is not going to even read your resolutions. So why are some on this council so determined to impose harmful measures that the ICJ refused to take? You all know the answers. Colleagues, a ceasefire is the epitome of a kick the can down the road policy. A ceasefire today means immunity for baby killers and rapists. It's an easy way to make this problem an issue for another day. With a ceasefire in place, Hamas will regroup, rearm, and their next attempted genocide against Israelis will only be a question of when, not if. Hamas has sworn publicly to commit the atrocities of October 7th again and again and again until Israel is annihilated. So why is the Council, charged with security, is so fixated on aiding these monsters to stay in power? Just yesterday, Israel exposed footage proving that Shiri Bibas and her two children, 4-year-old Ariel and 1-year-old Kfir, were taken to Gaza alive. So tell me, distinguished council members, a 4-year-old and a baby were taken hostage by Hamas, among others, and most of you choose to support a ceasefire? Why do you want to leave them in Gaza? Do you not see how immoral that is? And what kind of precedent this would set for terrorists around the globe? Did you think about baby Kfir when you voted on this resolution? A resolution that would ensure that Kfir, along with 133 other hostages, remain in dark terror tunnels? Did you think about Noa Argamani? Noa's look of sheer horror as she violently separated from her boyfriend Avinoam Or and taken to Gaza on the back of a motorbike has become a symbol of the hostages' plight. In the heart-wrenching video, you can hear Noa screaming and pleading with the terrorists not to abduct her. Noa's mother, Liora, born Chong Hong Lee, a Chinese Israeli citizen originally from Wuhan, is terminally ill with stage 4 brain cancer. All she asks is that she can hug Noa, her only daughter, one last time before she succumbs to her illness. To my Chinese colleague, I ask you, in the name of Liora Chong Hong Lee, rather than pushing for a harmful ceasefire which will keep Noa in Gaza, I urge you, pressure Hamas to release Noa so that her mother can see Noa one last time before her death. Colleagues, jihadists around the globe see that the body mandated to uphold international security is willing to allow murderous Hamas rapists to continue their reign of terror. Your calls for a ceasefire empower Hamas, giving them hope to stay in power. This does not ensure security, it prevents it. You truly want a ceasefire? Well, Israel also wants a ceasefire. Your children are not the ones that are falling in battle against bloodthirsty terrorists. They are ours. If Hamas survives, it will be our children that Hamas will murder in cold blood again. Israel seeks a ceasefire, but there is only one formula that we are willing to accept. All of our hostages must be released, and Hamas must turn themselves in. Colleagues, the Algerian resolution not only empowers jihadists by calling for a ceasefire, it also fails, again, to condemn Hamas for their heinous crimes. Not condemning Hamas's atrocities has now become a tradition here. It's tragic. Hamas Nazis invaded Israel, deliberately murdering families, raping women and girls, and destroying everything they could get their hands on. They are brutal terrorists who took pride in their barbarism. Yet, not once, not even once since October 7th, has this council or any UN body condemned Hamas and their violence. One day, we mentioned history here, when historians studied the reasons why the UN lost its standing and influence, the inability of this organization to condemn terrorists that slaughter children will be one of the driving factors. Mark my words. But the impact of this council's decisions spread much further than this room. If this council is incapable of condemning Hamas, UN officials feel like they have further legitimacy to whitewash Hamas. Mere days ago, Under-Secretary General Griffith stated that Hamas is not a terrorist group, but a political movement. Is the intentional brutal murder of hundreds of civilians not terror? Is the systematic rape of women not terror? Is beheading and burning children alive not terror? We all know Hamas is a terrorist organization, yet by staying silent in the face of Hamas's crimes and not condemning them, you allow such lies to perpetuate. Your politicized decision of silence promotes the falsehoods that Hamas can be reasoned with, that they are not the bloodthirsty terrorists that they are. And this is the stance that the UN adopts and promotes. Condemn Hamas as a council, condemn their atrocities, rid this institution of its shame. Do it for the sake of those butchered, for the sake of the hostages, for the sake of morality and truth. It's in your hands. Colleagues, some of you have approached me and asked me why Israel is so critical of the UN and its agencies. The recent event over the past weeks have hopefully made it clearer to you. 1 week ago, Special Rapporteur Albanese libelously stated that the victims of October 7th were not murdered for their identity, but in response to Israel's so-called oppression. This is victim blaming and a clear justification of terror. But for some UN employees, even poisonous words are not enough. Dozens of UNRWA employees took active roles in the October 7th massacre, while many more praised the savage attack. Faisal Ali Musallem El-Naami, an UNRWA social worker, stuffed the body of Jonathan Samerano into a truck to be taken to Gaza. A Hamas data center was located directly underneath UNRWA headquarters in Gaza, connected to UNRWA's power supply, and terror tunnels have been found running underneath various UNRWA facilities, schools, everything. Out of UNRWA's 1,300 employees in Gaza, 12%, I repeat, 12% are members of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and at least 236 of them are active terrorists in these organizations' armed wings. UNRWA has been proven to be an instrumental part of Hamas's terror machine, which makes UNRWA itself a terrorist organization. Yet, rather than take responsibility for the weaponization of this murderous UN agency, Commissioner General Lazzarini has chosen to say that he had no knowledge of Hamas's hold on his own agency. This is blatantly false. Israel exposed terror tunnels under UNRWA schools and supplied evidence of Hamas's exploitation of UNRWA. You can see it in my Twitter account. I personally sent letters to the Commissioner General and the Secretary General. We implored them for years to carry out a comprehensive search of all UNRWA facilities in Gaza. Yet not only did they refuse, they chose to bury their heads in the sand and ignore the reality. This is why every report, every statement or number provided by the UN cannot be trusted. In Gaza, dear colleagues, Hamas is the UN and the UN is Hamas. Distinguished council members, this ostrich tactic, burying one's head in the sand, is the modus operandi among UN leadership. Yet, no matter how deep one's head is buried, it will not change the reality on the ground. A terrorist is a terrorist. A terror organization is a terror organization. And a law-abiding liberal democracy will remain as such. Even if here at the UN, for political reasons, light becomes darkness and day becomes night. This is also the case with the escalating situation on Israel's northern border with Lebanon. For years, and you heard it here, for years Israel has called for this council to impose the implementation of Security Council Resolution 1701. Yet, for years, the UN has opted for the ostrich tactic. Tragically, This is no longer a situation that can be ignored. The clock is ticking. It is not a matter of years, but weeks before Israel will be forced to implement Resolution 1701 ourselves. Just yesterday, a Hezbollah drone was downed while flying over the Sea of Galilee, deep, deep inside Israel. Over 2,000 Hezbollah missiles and rockets have rained down on the cities of Israel's north. 2,000. And nearly 100,000 residents of northern Israel have been displaced due to the threat posed by Hezbollah, with, of course, Iran's backing. A ceasefire in Gaza is not only destructive for Israel and the Palestinians, it also ensures that a blind eye is turned to what is unfolding in the rest of the region. Be it the Houthis' relentless attacks on maritime trade, pro-Iran militias targeting even American service members, or Hezbollah's constant bombardment of Israel's north. The clock is ticking, and sadly, we will be forced to take decisive action. Terror will never be tolerated. Madam President, this Council must put politics aside for the sake of its mandate. A ceasefire that allows Hamas to remain in power means ensured death and destruction. Ignoring Hamas's atrocities and not condemning them means empowering terrorists worldwide. And focusing only on Gaza while looking away from the terror aggression across the region will lead to a future that none of us seek. The Security Council must fulfill its mandate. It must side with Israel against the forces of evil, and it must face reality. Reality is not found when one's head is buried in the sand. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel for his statement. I shall now give the floor to the representative of Qatar.
شكرا لكم السيد الرئيس. أود أن أهنئ بلدكم الصديق على رئاسة المجلس ويسرني أن أدلي بهذا البيان باسم دول مجلس التعاون لدول الخليج العربية وهي بلادي دولة قطر والمملكة العربية السعودية ودولة الكويت ودولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة وسلطنة عمان ومملكة البحرين وننضم للبيان الذي ستدليه المجموعة العربية بعد قليل. السيد الرئيس ينعقد اجتماعنا اليوم في ظل ظروف بالغة الخطورة حيث تحول الوضع في قطاع
The situation in the Gaza Strip has increasingly deteriorated, and we are facing the worst humanitarian disaster the world has seen. According to UN reports today, there is no safe place in the Gaza Strip. Almost all residents of the Gaza Strip, whose number is more than 2 million. These 2 million people are now refugees and people faced with the risk of starvation at a time when the aggression in by the Israeli occupying power against our Palestinian brethren has been ongoing for 5 months. The GCC has cautioned against the increased frequency of military attacks against our Palestinian brothers. We caution against the increased number of victims, the majority of whom are women and children who have been killed, wounded, and people under rubble. We call on the United Nations to assume responsibility. The UN officials have said that they have never seen a situation such as that taking place today. The UN Secretary General invoked Article 99 of the Charter, warned about the dangers of the collapse of the humanitarian system and of public order in Gaza. He also called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. There's a need to fully implement the resolutions 2720 and 2712 of the Security Council dating 2022. Madam President, the Arab states of the Gulf Cooperation Council condemn in the firmest terms the Israeli threat regarding the launch of a military operation against the city of Rafah. In the city of Gaza, we caution against the fact that these threats portend an increase in the violence levels and destabilization. These threats represent a danger to regional stability. We firmly condemn the attempts at forced displacement of civilians, and we firmly reject any military engagement in the city of Rafah. We caution against the new humanitarian disaster in that area. This is the last refuge for hundreds of thousands of displaced persons in the Gaza Strip.
حيال تعليق
In the
بعض الدول
same
المانحة
vein,
بتمويل
we
هالوكات
profoundly
الأونروا
regret the
وخاصة
suspension by
في ظل
some
الأوضاع
donors of
الإنسانية
their
الخطيرة
financing for
الراهنة
UNRWA,
حيث يعتمد
specifically
على
in the
الوكالة
light of the
5
dangerous
ملايين من
humanitarian
الفلسطينيين
situation
لا
which
سيما
we
في
are
قطاع غزة.
all bearing witness
وفي هذا
to. 5
الصدد
million
نضم
Palestinian
صوتنا
people
للأمين
depend
العام
on the
في
agency,
مناشدة
especially in the Gaza
بالدول
Strip.
التي
We
علقت
align
دعمها
ourselves in this
للأونروا
regard with what was
بمراجعة
said by the
قراراتها
SG in his call
واستئناف
for
تمويل
countries who have
هالوكالة
halted their
وذلك
support
حتى لا
to UNRWA
تتعرض
to
الكرة
reconsider
الإنسانية
and
الحالية
to
في غزة أكثر
reinstate their
مما هي
financing
عليه
for the agency to
وتجدد
end the
دولنا
humanitarian
موقفها
disaster
الثابت
in Gaza to
للعدالة في
prevent
القضية
it from
الفلسطينية
worsening. Our
والحقوق
countries
المشروعة
reiterate
للشعب
their
الفلسطيني
steadfast
الشقيق
position in support of the
وإقامة
just
دولته
Palestinian cause
المستقلة
and the
على
legitimate
حدود عام
rights of the fraternal people to
1767
establish an
وعاصمتها القدس
independent
الشرقية.
state on the 1967 borders with
السيدة
East
الرئيسة
Jerusalem as
تعرف
the
دول مجلس
capital.
التعاون عن
Madam President,
تقديرها
Arab states
للمسار
of the
التفاوضي المستمر
GCC
حول الوصول
extend their
لاتفاق إطاري
appreciation for
لهدنة
the ongoing
إنسانية جديدة في
negotiations
قطاع
around a
غزة
framework agreement
بتيسير من
for a new
بلادي دولة
humanitarian
قطر
truce in Gaza.
وجمهورية مصر
My country, the
العربية
State of
والولايات
Qatar,
المتحدة
has been
الأمريكية
facilitating these efforts
وذلك
alongside
بغية
the
إطلاق
Arab
سراح
Republic
الأساور
of Egypt and the
المحتجزين
US
وضمان وصول
to
المزيد من
free
المساعدات
hostages
الإنسانية
and detainees
والإغاثية
to
إلى
guarantee
قطاع غزة
greater
وحماية
deliveries of
المدنيين.
humanitarian assistance and to rescue
السيدة
efforts
الرئيسة
in
تعرف
Gaza
دول
to
مجلس
protect
التعاون عن
civilians.
أسفها البالغ
The
لفشل
Arab
المجلس
states
اليوم
of the
في اعتماد
GCC
مشروع
have
القرار المقدم من
profound
الجزائر
regrets
والمدعوم
regarding
من
the failure of
المجموعة
the Council to
العربية
adopt the
والذي
draft
أيدته
resolution
أغلبية
submitted by
أعضاء المجلس
Algeria. This was
كونه
supported by
مشروع
the
قرار
Arab group and
إنساني
the
في مضمونه
overwhelming majority
ويتسق
of
مع
members of the
القانون الدولي
Council.
الإنساني
This draft
ونود
is
التنويه في
humanitarian
هذا
by its
الصدد
content
إلى
and
أن
aligns
دولنا
with
سوف تستمر في
IHL.
جهودها في العمل
We
مع
wish to
الشركاء
emphasize in this regard that our
للسعي
country
في
will
كل
continue
المسارات لضمان
efforts
الوصول إلى وقف إطلاق
alongside
نار
partners at
إنساني
all
فوري
levels
في قطاع
to
غزة
guarantee the
حقنا
achievement of an
لدماء
immediate
الشقراء
humanitarian ceasefire in
الفلسطينيين في
Gaza.
القطاع
Let us end
ولضمان
the
وصول مزيد من
bloodletting
المساعدات
of the
الإنسانية
Palestinian
والإغاثية
people,
وحماية
and let us
المدنيين
deliver
وشكرا
adequate
لكم
volumes of
سيدة
humanitarian
الرئيسة.
assistance and relief to Gaza, and let us protect civilians.
I
Thank you
thank
very
the
much for your attention.
representative of Qatar for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Tunisia.
شكرا السيدة الرئيسة.
Thank you, Madam President.
أتشرف بإلقاء هذا
It is
البيان
my
باسم
honor
المجموعة
to deliver the
العربية
statement on behalf
وأود
of
في
the Arab
البداية أن
group.
أهنئكم
Allow me at the
وبلدكم
outset
غيانا
to
على تولي
congratulate
رئاسة
you and your
المجلس لهذا
country,
الشهر
Guyana,
وأعرب
for
لكم عن
presiding
الشكر
over the
بعقد
Security
هذه الجلسة.
Council this month. We thank you for
ونتقدم
holding this
بالشكر
session.
إلى
We would
الجزائر
like to
العضو
thank
العربي في
Algeria,
المجلس
the
على
Arab member in the
مبادرتها
Security
بتقديم
Council, for taking
مشروع
the
القرار
initiative to
ومساعيها
table the
طوال
draft
مسار
resolution
المفاوضات
and
من
make
أجل
every
الحفاظ
effort
على
during
وحدة
the
المجلس
negotiations to
والتوصل
preserve
إلى
the unity of the
توافق حول
Security Council
مطلب
and reach
حول
consensus
مطلب وقف
on a call for an
إطلاق النار
immediate
الفوري لأسباب
humanitarian
إنسانية
ceasefire.
لا تخطئها العين
This
وباعتباره
is
الإجراء
the
الأكثر
most
إلحاحا
urgent
في
measure
ظل الأوضاع الكارثية التي
during
تردى فيها
these
قطاع غزة
catastrophic
والمعاناة
circumstances
الإنسانية
in the
الرهيبة
Gaza Strip
للسكان
and the
الفلسطينيين
horrible
نتيجة
humanitarian suffering
مواصلة
of the
سلطات
Palestinian people.
الاحتلال
This is
لعدوانها
caused by the
وجرائم الحرب
occupation
والإبادة
forces'
الجماعية
continued
التي
aggression,
تقترفها في حق
war
الشعب
crimes,
الفلسطيني
genocide
بلا
against
هوادر
the Palestinian people, which
علاوة
continue
على إمعانها
unabated.
في إجراءات العقاب
The
الجماعي
occupation
ومنع
forces
المساعدات
also continue to
الإنسانية
impose a
والطبية
collective punishment and
والغذاء
prevent
والماء
humanitarian,
والوقود وكل
medical,
وسائل
food,
الحياة.
and fuel assistance
السيدة
to be
الرئيسة،
delivered to Gaza. Madam
تتوجه
President,
المجموعة العربية
the Arab
بالشكر
group would
للدول
like to
الأعضاء
thank
في
the
مجلس
Council
الأمن التي
members
ساهمت بكل
that
إيجابية
positively
وبشكل
contributed
بناء
and
في مسار
constructively
المفاوضات بخصوص مشروع
participated
القرار
in the
وصوتت
negotiations on the
لفائدته.
draft resolution and
وبقدر
voted
ما
for its
تعرب عن
adoption.
أسفها
At the
لفشل
same
المجلس
time,
في اعتماد
we
مشروع
regret that the
القرار
Council failed
وعجزه
to
مرة
adopt the
أخرى
draft
عن
resolution.
الاضطلاع
It
بمسؤوليته
failed once
القانونية
again to shoulder
والأخلاقية
its
باعتباره
moral and
الجهاز
legal
الرئيسي المسؤول
responsibility
عن حفظ
as the
الأمن
main
والسلم
organ
الدوليين،
entrusted with the maintenance of
فإنها
international
تجدد
peace and
تأكيد
security.
تمسكها
We reaffirm,
كما العديد من دول
like
العالم
other
وأعضاء
countries
مجلس الأمن
and members of the
والمنظمات
Security
الإنسانية
Council
والأممية
and
UN and
بضرورة
humanitarian
إقرار
organizations
وقف
the
فوري
need for
لإطلاق
an
النار
immediate
ومنع
ceasefire,
تنفيذ
the
سلطات
need to
الاحتلال
prevent
لمخططها الذي
the
يستهدف أكثر
occupation
من
powers from
1.5
implementing
مليون
their schemes
فلسطيني
which
في
target
رفح
more than
ومنع
1.5
تكرار
million
جرائم
Palestinians
التهجير
in
القسري
Rafah, the
للفلسطينيين
need to prevent yet
وإفراغ
another
الأرض
forced
الفلسطينية
displacement
من
of
سكانها.
Palestinians and emptying of Palestinian land.
وتعتبر المجموعة العربية أنه من غير
It
المقبول
is
بكل
unacceptable
المقاييس أن
by
يظل
any
مجلس الأمن
standard
مرتهنا للحسابات
for the
السياسية
Security
والمصالح
Council to
الضيقة
continue to
في
work at
حين
the whim
تتواصل
of political
الاعتداءات اليومية على
calculations and
الشعب
narrow
الفلسطيني
interests at a
وتتعمق
time where
معاناته
daily attacks
ويفقد الآلاف
continue
من
on
أبنائه بمن
Palestinian
فيهم
people,
الأطفال
deepening their
وكبار
suffering
السن
and killing
والنساء
thousands,
والمرضى.
including children,
إن عجز
women,
مجلس
elderly,
الأمن
and
اليوم عن
sick people.
التكلم
The
بصوت
Security
واحد
Council failed
وإعلاء
today to
مبادئ
speak in one
القانون
voice and
الدولي
put the
والقانون
principles of
الدولي
international
الإنساني
law and
والحق في
international
الحياة
humanitarian law
يوجه
and the
مرة
right to
أخرى
life
الرسالة
first.
الخاطئة
This sends
للقوة القائمة
the wrong
بالاحتلال
message once
ويطلق
again to the
يدها
occupying
لتواصل
power
جرائمها
and gives it a carte
واستهتارها
blanche to
بالشرعية
continue
الدولية
its crimes,
واعتبار نفسها
disregarding
فوق القانون
international
والمساءلة
legitimacy and
كما
considering
يعمق
itself
أزمة
above the
الثقة
law and
في
above
مصداقية
all
هذا الجهاز
accountability.
الأممي
It
الهام.
worsens the lack of
وفي هذا
trust in
السياق
the credibility of
تجدد
this
المجموعة
important
العربية
organ.
رفضها
In
لسياسات
this vein,
الانحياز
we
لمخططات
reject
سلطات
once again
الاحتلال
the policies of
وتوفير الحماية
favoritism
لها
of the
على حساب
occupation
أرواح
schemes and its
الآلاف من
protection at the
الفلسطينيين
expense of
التي تزهق
thousands of
وأرضه
Palestinians who are
التي
being
تسرق
killed
عن
and
طريق
their land
مخططات
that is
التهجير
being stolen
والاستيطان.
based on
وتؤكد
the
المجموعة
schemes of
العربية
displacement
رفضها
and settlement.
لازدواجية
We
المعايير
reject
التي
the double
ساهمت في
standards
إطالة
that
أمد
only
القضية
protract the
الفلسطينية
Palestinian
وفي
question,
عدم تنفيذ أي من
that lead
القرارات
to the
الخاصة بها
non-implementation of
بكل
any
ما رافق
relevant
ذلك من
resolution.
مجازر
This
وتنكيل
has
في حق
caused
الشعب الفلسطيني
massacres and abuse of the
وانتهاكات
rights
لحقوقه
of the
وهي
Palestinian
تطالب
people. We
بالتعاطي
call
مع كل
for
القضايا
dealing
والوضعيات
with
بنفس
all
المقاييس
situations
ودرجة
and
الالتزام.
questions with the same level
كما
of
تطالب المجموعة
commitment and with the
العربية
same
المجتمع
standards.
الدولي ومجلس
We
الأمن
call upon the
بضمان توفير
International
الحماية
Community and the Security Council
للفلسطينيين
to provide
وتسريع
protection
دخول
to
وإيصال
Palestinian
المساعدات
civilians and
الإنسانية
accelerate
دون إعاقة
the
إلى قطاع
unimpeded
غزة
entry and delivery
تنفيذا
of
لقراري
humanitarian
مجلس الأمن
assistance to
2712
Gaza in
و
implementation of the
2720
Security Council
كما
resolutions
تؤكد
2720
على
and
دعمها الكامل
2712.
لجهود
We
كبيرة
fully
منسق
support
الأمم
the
المتحدة
efforts of the UN
للشؤون
Senior Humanitarian
الإنسانية
and Reconstruction
وإعادة الإعمار في غزة
Coordinator in Gaza,
سيغريد كاد
Sigrid Kaag,
ومساعيها
and her
للاستجابة
efforts
للحالة
to
الإنسانية
address
الكارثية
the
التي
current
يشهدها
catastrophic
القطاع.
humanitarian situation in the Strip.
السيد الرئيس،
Madam President,
إن الجهود الجارية
current
للتوصل إلى
efforts
اتفاق
to
إطار
agree
لتبادل
on an
الأسرى
exchange of
والمحتجزين وإقرار
prisoners,
هدنة
detained
لا
persons, and
تتعارض
on a
مع
truce
مطلب الوقف
do not
الفوري
go
لإطلاق النار
against the
الذي
call
لا
for an
يمكن
immediate
إلا أن
ceasefire,
يساعد
because the
على تسهيل
ceasefire
مثل هذه
can only
المساعي.
facilitate such
ولا
efforts.
تفسير للإصرار على رفض
Nothing
اعتماد
can
مشروع
justify
القرار
the
الخاص
insistence
بهذا
to
المطلب
reject the draft
وتمكين
resolution
المجموعة
calling for a
الدولية ومجلس
ceasefire
الأمن من التكلم بصوت
and
واحد
allowing the
إلا
international
سعي
community and the
حكومة
Security
الاحتلال
Council to speak in
لمواصلة
one voice,
عملياتها
except the
العسكرية
occupation
وتنفيذ
government's
مخططها
attempt
الرامي
to
إلى
continue its
تهجير
military
الفلسطينيين من
operations
أرضهم.
and
ومن هذا
displace
المنطلق
Palestinians.
وإزاء هذا التوجه
As
الذي
we see
يهدف
the
إلى
attempt to
تحييد
steer the
مجلس
Council
الأمن
away
ومنعه من
and
تحمل
prevent it from
مسؤوليته
shouldering
التي
its
يقرها ميثاق
responsibilities set
الأمم
out in the
المتحدة
UN
في
Charter in
مثل هذه
such
الأوضاع
catastrophic
الكارثية.
situations, we cannot
فإننا
help but
نتساءل
wonder what
عن محددات دور
exactly
المجلس
is the role
ومتى
of the
سيسمح
Security
له
Council.
بالقيام
When will
بهذا
it be
الدور
allowed
المفترض
to play the
وكم من
supposed
روح
role?
بريئة يجب
How
أن
many
تزهق
innocent
قبل أن
lives should be
يتحقق
killed
ذلك؟
before this actually
ألا يكفي
happens?
قتل أكثر من
Are
28,000
28,000 people
وجرح
killed,
حوالي 70,000
70,000 injured, and
وتهجير
1.3
أكثر من
million
1.3
displaced not
مليون
enough? Is
وتدمير
the
كل البنى
destruction of
التحتية
all the
والمساكن
infrastructure,
والمستشفيات
homes,
والمدارس
hospices,
ودور
schools,
العبادة
worship
ومكاتب الأمم
places,
المتحدة
and UN
وقتل
offices not
العشرات من
enough?
موظفي
Is the
الوكالات
killing of
الأممية
dozens of
والإنسانية
UN and
والصحفيين.
humanitarian workers and
السيد
journalists
الرئيس،
not enough? Madam
كذلك
President,
تدين المجموعة العربية
the
بأشد
Arab group
العبارات
strongly
اعتداءات
condemns
السلطة القائمة
the
بالاحتلال
repeated attacks by the
المتكرر
occupation
على
power
أراضي كل من سوريا
on
ولبنان
Syria and
وخرقها
Lebanon and its
لسيادتهما
violation of their
وقتلها
sovereignty,
للمدنيين
the
الأبرياء
killing
وهو
of
ما يقوض
innocent
الأمن والسلم
civilians,
والاستقرار في المنطقة
and
والعالم.
anything that threatens peace
ستواصل
and
المجموعة
stability in the
العربية
region and the
تحركاتها
world.
على جميع
We will
المستويات
continue to make
وفي
every
كافة
effort at
المحافل
all levels
لتتحمل
and in
المجموعة
all
الدولية
fora
مسؤوليتها
so that the
بعيدا عن
international community
الانتقائية
shoulders its
والحسابات
responsibilities without
السياسية
any selectivity
ولتفرض
or
على
political
سلطات الاحتلال
considerations,
احترام
to
القانون
compel the
الدولي والقانون
occupation power
الدولي
to
الإنساني
respect the
وتضع حدا
international law and international
لمخططاتها
humanitarian law
وانتهاكاتها
and
الجسيمة
end its
بحق
criminal
الشعب
schemes
الفلسطيني.
and blatant
شكرا
violations
سيد الرئيس.
of the rights of the Palestinian
I
people.
thank
Thank
the
you, Madam
representative of
President.
Tunisia for his statement. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Egypt to participate in this meeting. meeting. It is so decided. I now give the floor to the representative of Egypt.
شكرا السيدة الرئيسة.
Thank you,
السادة الأعضاء،
Madam
لقد
President.
شهدنا صباح اليوم
members,
مجددا نموذجا
Today
صارخا
morning,
من
we have
ازدواج
witnessed
المعايير.
once again a
وقد
stark
أعاق
example of
الوفد
double standards.
الأمريكي للمرة
The U.S.
الثالثة
delegation for the
محاولة
third
استصدار
time
قرار من مجلس
has
الأمن
obstructed
لإيقاف وقف إطلاق النار
the
في
adoption
غزة.
by the Security Council of a
رغم
ceasefire
تصويت
resolution on Gaza,
13
despite
عضوا من مجلس
13
الأمن
votes in
لصالح مشروع
favor
القرار الجزائري
of
المقدم بدعم
the draft
كامل من
resolution
المجموعتين العربية
submitted by
والإسلامية
Algeria
في
with
الأمم
full
المتحدة.
support by the Arab and
وبقدر
Islamic groups in the
العرفان
United Nations.
للجزائر العضو العربي بمجلس
are
الأمن
grateful
على تقديم القرار
for Algeria, the Arab
وبقدر
member of the
الامتنان
Security
لكل
Council,
من
for
صوت
putting forward the
لصالح
draft resolution.
القرار
We are
يعبر
grateful for all those
لصالح
who
مشروع
voted
القرار
in
يعبر
favor
وفد
of the
مصر
draft
عن
resolution.
المزيد من الإحباط
Yet
وخيبة
the delegation
الأمل
of
إزاء
Egypt
استمرار
expresses its
عرقلة
disappointment and
الولايات المتحدة
frustration
الأمريكية
as a
لمساعي
result
وقف
of
إطلاق النار
the obstruction by
عبر
the US
اطلاع
of
الجهاز
endeavors for
الرئيسي
ceasefire
المنوط
by
به حفظ
obstructing
السلم
this
والأمن
main
الدوليين
body
بواجباته.
entrusted with maintenance of international
السادة الأعضاء، أين يقف
peace
هذا
and security
التصويت
to assume
الأمريكي
its
إزاء
duties.
المعاناة الإنسانية التي
Distinguished
وصلت لحد
delegates,
الكارثة
where was
من الحرب
stand
على
in the
غزة؟
face of the humanitarian
وكيف
suffering that reached
يستقيم أن
the
تتم دعوتنا
catastrophe level after
إلى مجتمع
the
دولي قائم
20th
على
week
القواعد
of the war in
فيما
Gaza?
عندما
How can
نطلب
we call
تطبيق
for
تلك
a rules-based
القواعد لا نلقى
international
سوى
order,
الآذان
while when we call
الصماء؟
for the implementation of these rules, we are met
أليس
only with
سكرتير عام
deaf ears?
الأمم المتحدة
When the Secretary General
وإعماله
of the
للمادة
UN
99
invoked
من ميثاق
Article
الأمم
99
المتحدة
of the
بكاشف
Charter of the
للإجراء
United
المطلوب
Nations,
من مجلس الأمن، أليس القرار
wasn't it
الصادر
an
من محكمة
indicative
العدل
of the
الدولية
measure
والذي
requested
طلب
from
اتخاذ
the Security
إجراءات
Council?
محددة
Isn't the
بكاشف
ICJ
للحاجة
order
الفورية لوقف إطلاق
indicating
النار؟
provisional measures
أليست تقارير مكتب
indicative
تنسيق
of
الشؤون
the urgent
الإنسانية
need for a ceasefire?
ومنظمة الصحة
The
العالمية
reports
والأونروا
from OCHA,
وما تعكسه
WHO,
بشأن
and UNRWA
كارثية الوضع الإنساني
on
الراهن
the
في غزة
catastrophic humanitarian
ولا
situation
سيما
in
على
Gaza, in
الحدود مع
particular
مصر في
along
رفح
the
بكافية
borders with Egypt
لتقنع
in
الوفد
Rafah?
الأمريكي
Aren't
بالتصويت
they
لصالح
enough
وقف
to
إطلاق
convince
النار
the US delegation
بعد
to
مرور
vote in
140
favor of
يوما على بدء النزاع
ceasefire
وبعد أن فقد أكثر من
140
30,000
days
إنسان
after the onslaught
أغلبهم
of
من
the
النساء
conflict and
والأطفال
after more
حياتهم
than
جراء
30,000
الحرب الجائرة
persons
في
lost their
غزة؟
life,
سأل
women
الأعضاء،
and children,
مصر هي أول من أقام
as a result
السلام
of the
مع
war
إسرائيل من
in
الدول
Gaza.
العربية،
Distinguished
ومصر
delegates,
هي
Egypt
أحرص
was
الدول على استقرار منطقة
the
الشرق الأوسط.
first Arab country to have peace with
وبينما
Israel.
يتواصل إخفاق
Egypt is more
المجلس
keen on the
مجلس الأمن
stability
في
of
إيقاف
the
الحرب،
Middle East region,
ستستمر مصر في
and
تحمل
Egypt
العبء
will
الأكبر
continue to
سياسيا
bear the
وأمنيا
heaviest brunt
وإنسانيا
politically,
جراء الأزمة،
security, humanitarianly
ولكنها
as a result
ملتزمة
of the crisis.
بالعمل المضني
And
والمتواصل
despite
على
the failure
كافة
of the
الأصعدة
Council,
لإيقاف
Egypt is
نزيف
committed
الدماء،
to work
لإيقاف الحرب
tirelessly to put an
المدمرة،
end to the bloodshed, to put an
لاستعادة
end to
الأفق
the destructive
السياسي،
war, to restore political
لتحقيق آمال الشعبين
horizon, to achieve the
الفلسطيني
aspirations of
والإسرائيلي في
the
الأمن
Palestinian and
والاستقرار
Israeli peoples
وفقا
in
للقرارات
peace and
الشرعية
stability
الدولية
in line
وإنشاء
with
الدولة الفلسطينية
international
المستقلة على
legitimacy
خطوط الرابع
resolutions,
من
with the
يونيو
establishment of the independent Palestinian
1967
state along the lines
وعاصمتها
of June
القدس.
1967 with
سيدة
East
الرئيسة،
Jerusalem as its
مصر
capital.
تتفاوض
Mr. President,
وتتوسط
Egypt
بمنتهى
negotiates
الجدية
and mediates
بالتنسيق مع كل من
meaningfully
الولايات
and seriously
المتحدة وقطر
in
وإسرائيل والجانب
coordination with
الفلسطيني
the US, Qatar,
لسرعة
Israel,
إطلاق
and
المحتجزين
Palestine to
والرهائن والأسرى
expeditedly release
الفلسطينيين
the
وسرعة دفع
Palestinian
المساعدات الإنسانية
hostages
بأقصى سرعة
and to deliver
وبأكبر قدر
humanitarian aid
ممكن
at
لإنهاء
scale,
الوضع
to put an
الإنساني
end
الكارثي
to the catastrophic
في غزة
humanitarian situation in
لإنقاذ
Gaza,
الأشقاء الفلسطينيين من الحصار
to
الجائر
save the Palestinian
المفروض
brothers from
عليهم
the
من
unjust
سلطات
siege
الاحتلال
imposed on
الإسرائيلي،
them by the Israeli
والتصدي
occupying
لكافة
power,
المحاولات
and to
الإسرائيلية
stand in the face
لفرض
of all
التهجير
attempts by
القسري
Israel
للشعب
to
الفلسطيني
impose
بهدف تصفية قضيته النبيلة.
forced
تناشد
displacement
مصر
on the
مجلس الأمن
Palestinian
وكل
people to
القوى
liquidate
الدولية
the
المسؤولة
Palestinian
إنقاذ
cause.
خيار
Egypt
السلم
calls on the Security
عبر
Council and all
الإنفاذ
responsible
الفوري لوقف
international
إطلاق
powers
النار.
to
هذا لن
save
يعرقل
the
جهود
choice for
الوساطة
peace by
الجارية، بل
immediate
سيتيح
implementation of
لها
ceasefire. This will
الظروف
not
المناسبة
impede
لتنجح.
the
دعونا
ongoing mediation
نتفاوض
efforts, but
ونتوسط
rather will
وسط
create the
انسياب
conducive
المساعدات
conditions for its
الإنسانية
success. Let us
واستعادة
negotiate
الهدوء
and mediate
وتضميد
in an
جراح
environment
المصابين
of
خاصة
smooth flow
الأطفال
of
اليتامى والنساء
humanitarian
الثكلى
aid
بدلا من أن
and restored
نتفاوض
calm
وسط الدمار
and
والخراب الذي
healing the wounds
تخلفه
of the
آلة
wounded,
الحرب الإسرائيلية
the wounded,
المدمرة.
instead of negotiating
سيد
and
الرئيس،
mediating
سادة
in an
الأعضاء،
atmosphere of war and
نداء
destruction.
مصر لكم جميعا جميعا
caused
واضح
by
وبسيط.
the destructive Israeli war
أوقفوا
machine.
إطلاق النار الآن.
Mr.
ceasefire
Madam
now.
President, Egypt's
وأرجو ألا
call for all of
يخطئ
you
أي
is
طرف
plain and simple.
مجددا إدراك
Ceasefire
هذه
now.
الرسالة
Let's
النبيلة
not
والمباشرة
mistake
والتي
this
لا تهدف
noble
سوى
and
لحماية
direct message
المدنيين
as
دون حسابات سياسية.
anything as
وتحذر
having
مصر
political calculations.
مجددا
It aims
من
only at
المخاطر
saving
الكارثية
the civilians. Egypt warns
والمحدقة
once again
بالأشقاء
against
الفلسطينيين
the
جراء الخطط
catastrophic
الإسرائيلية
risks
المعلنة
looming against
لاقتحام
the
مدينة
Palestinian
رفح.
people
كما
as a
تحذر
result
مصر
of
من
the
استمرار
declared
تدهور الوضع
plans of
الإقليمي
Israel
جراء استمرار
to have
هذه
ground
الحرب
offensive in
المدمرة.
Rafah.
وشكرا
And we warn the
سيدة
international community of the consequences of this destructive war.
I thank
Thank
the
you, Madam
representative
President.
of Egypt for his statement. The representative of China has asked for the floor to make a further statement, and I now give them the floor.
Thank you, Madam President.
刚才以
Earlier,
色列代表
we
给
heard
中国代
the
表团
representative
提出了一个问题，
Israel raising a question to the
我
Chinese
们要回答
delegation.
你的是，
In response, we'd like to
每一
say
个生命
every
都是宝
life
贵，
is precious.
都有权利得
Every
到保
life
护。
has the right to be protected.
Final number, and we got needed humanitarian assistance in. And we're continuing to work on this. This is not a change. It is not it reflects what we've been doing all along. It hasn't changed what we've been doing.
Thank you, Ambassador. Sam Azim, Al Arabi Al Jadid newspaper. I have two questions. First, you have been saying that the Security Council, that you are not agreeing to the resolution under, different reasons, but among others that the Security Council doesn't condemn Hamas. But as a matter of fact, on October 18th, it was the US that vetoed a resolution that condemned Hamas. This is one thing. The second thing, I think a lot of Palestinians ask the question, what is the line? When is enough Palestinian? There have been more than 29 Palestinian civilians who were killed, majority of whom women and children, and people are asking how many deaths are enough for the US to stop delivering weapons and to call for a ceasefire immediately for humanitarian reasons. Thank you.
In answer to your first question, there were a number of other issues with that resolution. It did call for a condemnation of Hamas. It did not recognize Israel's right to self-defense, which is a right that Israel has. And there were other issues with that particular resolution. Since that time, we still have not gotten condemnation of Hamas, despite the fact that I think it is, every council member, almost every council member will say that in their statements. We think it should be reflected in a resolution, even a humanitarian resolution. And let me just say, every life matters. And so it is important that we find a solution that will stop the killing and deaths and suffering of the Palestinian people. And that's why we're on the ground 24/7. No one else is putting their people out there. No one else is putting skin and boots on the ground to find a solution to this situation. And we'll keep working on that every single day.
Hi, Ambassador. China described your position that the Algerian draft would undermine regional efforts at the hostage deal as completely untenable, given the situation on the ground. Explain then, Ambassador, how the Algerian draft would have placed those talks in jeopardy, given that the Algerian text also called for the immediate release of those hostages.
Yes, but they also call for an immediate ceasefire, which would give Hamas the cover of not releasing the hostage. Part of the ceasefire that we're working on requires that they do exactly that. And this resolution did not make that connection. And it was our concern that it would send the wrong message to Hamas, that this resolution, which actually gives them something that they have asked for without requiring them to do something in return, would have meant that the fighting would have continued, because without the hostage releases, we know that the fighting is going to continue. Thank you all.
you.